I needed to get away from everything. The noise, the pressure, the same faces, the endless notifications on my phone, the deadlines that made my chest feel like it was shrinking. I had been working nonstop for years. No breaks, no real vacations. I wasn't burned out exactly, but I was close. Close enough that I knew if I didn't do something soon, I'd start hating everything. So I decided to rent a cabin for 2 weeks in a place where my phone barely worked and the nearest grocery store was an hour away. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't want to see people walking past my house or hear cars going by. I just wanted trees, quiet, and some time to breathe. The cabin I found online was buried deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. I chose it partly because of how isolated it was. The photos showed it surrounded by dense pine forest, not a neighbor or road in sight, just a narrow dirt trail that cut through the woods to reach it. The listing said it was used mostly by hunters during the fall, which made sense. It was pretty basic, with stove, old propane fridge, no running water, and just a small solar panel system that charged 1 or 2 lights. But it had a bed, a table, and a roof. That was enough for me. I packed everything I thought I'd need. Cans of food, rice, beans, a small camping stove, batteries, books, a map, extra clothes. I even brought a 5-gallon water jug and some smaller bottles, since the cabin had a rain barrel but no guaranteed source. I printed the directions because I knew I couldn't rely on GPS once I got far enough into the woods. I left a copy of the map with a friend just in case something happened, though I told him I'd be totally fine. The drive was long, 7 hours north, most of it just highway, and then 2 hours on smaller, rougher roads, until I finally reached a faded sign nailed to a tree that said, North Boundary Trail. From there, it was another 40 minutes down a tight, rutted trail that scraped the sides of my SUV and jarred the suspension with every dip and route. I had to drive slowly, and even then, I bottomed out a few times. But eventually, the trees opened up slightly and I saw the roof of the cabin peeking out from behind some spruce trees. It looked just like the pictures, maybe a little smaller but solid. The clearing around it was about the size of a small backyard, with long grass, a fire pit made of rocks, and an old metal chair that had been left to rust. The trees rose tall and close on all sides. There were no fences, no paths except the one I drove in on, no signs of people. Just the cabin, the woods, and the quiet. I got out of the car and just stood there for a while. No engine noise, no wind, no voices. Just the faint creaking of trees and an occasional bird call. I felt better already. Unloading took a while because I had to carry everything from the car to the porch. But I didn't mind. It gave me something to do, and I liked the physical work. The air smelled like pine and dirt and dry leaves. Inside, the cabin was musty but clean. There was one main room with a bed in the corner, a small table, 2 chairs, a few shelves, and the old wood stove. A narrow door led to a small storage room in the back that had a rusty axe and some tools hanging on nails. The windows were dusty but intact, and the door had a strong bolt. I opened all the windows to let in fresh air and started organizing my things. The first few days were peaceful. I read, chopped wood, walked in the forest, cooked simple meals, and just sat on the porch watching squirrels run across the branches. The isolation felt good. I had no phone service, no noise, and no pressure to do anything. At night, I'd light a candle or a lantern, sit by the stove, and stare at the flames. Then I'd go to sleep early and wake up with the light. I started feeling normal again, like my body was slowly unclenching. But around the 4th night, I noticed something that didn't feel right. It wasn't anything big at first, just small things that I brushed off. Like the rain barrel was full one morning, even though it hadn't rained in 2 days. Or the pile of kindling next to the porch was slightly rearranged, like someone had dug through it. I figured maybe a raccoon or a squirrel had been poking around. I even found some small tracks in the mud near the woods, but they looked like deer prints, so I didn't think much of it. This was the woods. Things moved around. But then, one morning, I walked out behind the cabin and found a tin can sitting on a stump about 20 feet into the trees. It was one of mine, an empty chili can that I had crushed and thrown into the trash bag inside the storage room. I knew I hadn't put it out there. I hadn't even taken the trash out yet. The bag was still hanging in the corner. But when I checked, the can was gone from the bag. That bothered me. Not scared me exactly, but made me feel off. I took the can back inside and checked all the doors and windows. Everything was locked. Nothing was broken. But now I was thinking about the fact that the cabin didn't have any real lock on the storage room. Just a latch hook that could be opened from the outside if someone really wanted to. I pushed a chair under the doorknob that night just to feel better. The next day, I walked out into the woods to try to clear my head. I followed a deer trail for a while, then wandered off it, not really watching where I was going. I wasn't afraid of getting lost because I'd been marking trees with little red cloth strips when I hiked. But after about an hour, I found something that made my stomach drop. It was a small campsite, hidden in a dense patch of pine trees, barely visible until you were right on top of it. There was a blue tarp tied between two trees, some dirty blankets, an old cooler, and a pile of empty cans and food wrappers. A fire pit made from a circle of stones, with black ash still inside. It wasn't old, maybe a few days at most. Some of the wrappers were the same brand I had brought. Some of the cans were the same kind. It was like someone had been following me, or at least using the same trail after me and picking through my trash. There was no one there, no sound, but it felt like someone had just been there that morning. I backed away slowly and made my way back to the cabin, checking behind me more than I'd like to admit. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't hurt. Nothing had been taken, but now I felt like I wasn't alone. I decided not to stay the full 2 weeks. I'd leave in a couple days. I told myself I was just being cautious. I didn't want to overreact, but something felt wrong. That night, I locked everything and kept my hatchet next to the bed. Just after midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Not animal footsteps, human. Slow, careful steps through the dry leaves, moving around the side of the cabin. Then nothing for a long time. Then a creak on the porch. Then silence again. I didn't move. I lay in bed frozen, barely breathing, staring at the dark ceiling. I waited to hear the doorknob turn or glass break. But nothing happened. Just silence for over an hour. In the morning, I stepped outside and saw fresh footprints in the dirt around the cabin. Not boots, bare feet. Human, wide, dirty prints leading from the woods to the cabin and then back again. I followed them for about 50 feet until they vanished into the underbrush. I packed up that afternoon. I left most of the extra supplies behind. I just wanted to get out. But when I walked to my SUV, I saw that 2 of the tires were slashed. Not popped, slashed clean through with something sharp. The air drained out of me. My stomach felt hollow. I was stuck. I went back inside, bolted the door, and sat there the rest of the day, staring at the walls. I had no way to call for help. No phone signal, no internet. My only option was to wait for someone to drive down the trail, which almost never happened, or to walk out. The problem was the walk to the main road was 10 miles through thick woods. I could try it, but if someone was watching the cabin, they could follow me. Or worse, that night I didn't sleep. I heard sounds outside again, sticks breaking, the sound of something brushing against the walls. But nothing broke in, not yet. In the morning, I filled my backpack with water, food, and my map. I didn't take the trail. I cut straight through the woods toward the road, moving fast and quiet, checking behind me constantly. About halfway through, I saw a shape in the trees behind me. Person, standing still, watching, not moving. I didn't run. I just turned and kept walking, pretending I hadn't seen them. It took me 5 hours to reach the road. When I got there, I flagged down a passing truck and got a ride to the nearest town. I didn't explain much. I just said my car broke down and I needed help. The sheriff took me back a few days later with 2 deputies. We found the cabin just like I left it, but the campsite in the woods was gone. No tarp, no blankets, no fire pit. Just flat earth and pine needles. The deputies said it was probably just a squatter. Maybe someone living off the grid. They didn't find anyone. They didn't seem to think it was a big deal. But I knew someone had been there. I knew they had watched me, waited until I was asleep, walked around barefoot, and slashed my tires to keep me from leaving. I never went back. I sold the rest of the food, donated my camping gear, and told myself I didn't need that kind of peace again. Not that kind. Not the kind that watches you from the woods, waiting for you to let your guard down. I wasn't planning on staying in the cabin for too long. It was more like a break, a pause from work, city noise, and everything else I had started to hate. I had rented the place for a full month, deep in the woods of northern Michigan. There were no neighbors, no paved roads, no cell service unless I drove about 12 miles toward the closest small town. It was exactly what I thought I needed. The cabin was small but solid. It sat just above a low hill, about 200 feet from a large, stagnant lake. The trees stretched forever in every direction, a thick blanket of pine and birch. There were no walking trails, no signs, no fencing. It felt like the woods went on forever, and honestly, I liked that. I didn't want anyone near me. I had been feeling off for months, like something was brewing in the background of my life that I didn't know how to fix. I was tired, disconnected, burnt out. I arrived on a Wednesday morning. It was a 6-hour drive from the city. The cabin's gravel driveway was long and curved, disappearing into the trees. I parked beside the building, shut off the car, and listened. No traffic, no voices, just the ticking of the engine and birds somewhere high in the branches. It was silent in a way that felt unfamiliar. The cabin looked old but taken care of. The outside was faded red wood, with a small deck and 2 stairs leading up to the front door. There were 3 visible windows from where I stood, one in the kitchen, one in the living room, and one in the bedroom. They were all shut and covered with cheap white curtains. Inside, it was simple. One large room acted as a combined living and dining area. A narrow hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. The kitchen was on the right. Everything smelled faintly of cedar and something else I couldn't place, like metal or dampness. I unpacked, set my food in the fridge, and opened some windows to let the breeze in. The place was quiet except for creaking floorboards when I walked. That first night, I fell asleep on the couch with a book in my lap. I had planned to do some reading, write a bit, maybe just stare at the lake. I didn't even make it to the bed. The quiet of the cabin, the lack of movement around me, it all lulled me into sleep without trying. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, just a dull, low thump. It came from under the couch or somewhere near it. I sat up and listened. The cabin was pitch black except for the moonlight coming through the window. Another thump, then a soft, dragging sound. Could have been an animal. Raccoons, maybe. A squirrel. The cabin sat on wooden beams about 2 feet off the ground. Plenty of room under there for small animals. But this sound felt different, slower, heavier. I got up and turned on the small light in the kitchen. The moment the bulb flickered on, the sound stopped. I stood there, not moving, listening for it to return. Nothing, just my own breathing and the hum of the refrigerator. Eventually, I shook it off. I convinced myself it was nothing, probably some large raccoon dragging something under the house. It was the woods, after all. I went to bed that night and didn't hear anything else. Over the next few days, I started settling into a routine. Wake up around 7, walk down to the lake, drink coffee on the deck, read, maybe do some writing. It was peaceful. I was alone, but I didn't feel lonely. The quiet started to feel like a kind of medicine I didn't know I needed. But every few nights, I would hear the sounds again. Always late, between 2 and 4 in the morning. Sometimes it was a soft knock beneath the floor. Sometimes it was a dragging noise. Once, I thought I heard what sounded like a low cough. I checked under the cabin twice, shining a flashlight through the crawl space. It was just dirt, rocks, and old insulation. Nothing moved when I looked. Still, I started locking the doors religiously. I even began dragging a chair in front of the door before bed, even though it had a deadbolt. Something about those noises had begun to bother me more than I wanted to admit. They didn't feel like animals. They felt like something else, something aware of me. One morning, I woke up and found my front door unlocked. The chair I had placed in front of it was pushed slightly to the left, maybe a few inches. I froze when I saw it. I hadn't sleepwalked. I don't do that. And I clearly remembered locking the door and setting the chair down. I even remember the sound it made when I dragged it into place. I searched the cabin top to bottom. Closets, cabinets, under the bed. I even checked behind the water heater in the bathroom. Nothing. Everything was exactly how I had left it. But the door had been unlocked. The chair had moved. There was no explanation that made sense. I went outside and walked around the cabin. Nothing looked disturbed. No footprints. No signs of anyone coming or going. The ground was dry and hard, but still, I would have seen something. I considered leaving that day, packing everything up and driving back to the city. But I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I thought I was just being paranoid. Maybe I just didn't want to believe something was wrong. That night, I set a few small things up near the door. I leaned a broom across the inside of the doorknob and stacked 3 empty cans on the floor nearby. If someone opened the door, the broom would fall, the cans would roll. It wasn't much, but it would let me know. I went to sleep on the couch again. I didn't even pretend to read. I just laid there, facing the door, blanket up to my chest, staring into the dark. At 3:42 a.m., I heard it. A click, then the slow, quiet sound of the doorknob turning. The broom hit the floor. The cans rolled. I bolted up. My chest was pounding. I didn't move for several seconds. I just sat there, breathing through my nose, trying to stay calm. I had no weapon, no phone service, no neighbors, just me and whoever had just opened that door. But no one entered. The door didn't open all the way, just enough for the broom to fall. I waited another minute, then 2, then slowly stood and turned on the kitchen light. The door was still closed, latched, locked. The broom was on the floor. The cans had rolled toward the hallway, but the door was still locked. That's when I realized what was happening. It wasn't someone coming in. It was someone coming up. I opened the front door and stepped outside with a flashlight. I walked around the deck and bent down, shining the light under the cabin. Something caught my eye, near the middle, where the ground dipped slightly. A small wooden hatch. It was almost invisible, covered in dust and pine needles. I didn't even know there was an access point under the cabin. But there it was, a rectangular door about 2 feet by 2 feet, set into the dirt. I stared at it for a long time, not moving. Then I went back inside, locked the door, and sat in the kitchen until the sun came up. The next day, I brought a shovel and gloves down there. I cleared the dirt around the hatch, pulled it open, and stared into the darkness below. A hole, maybe 4 feet deep. Inside, it looked like a den or a crawl space someone had dug out. There were blankets, empty cans of food, a small plastic crate with a few items, matches, a cracked flashlight, half a roll of toilet paper, torn backpack. Someone had been living there. For how long, I had no idea. I ran back inside and started pulling my stuff together. I didn't care if I had paid for the full month. I wasn't staying another night. I shoved everything back into bags, loaded the car, and drove straight to the nearest sheriff's office. They took my statement and sent a deputy out to check. He confirmed there had been signs of someone living under the cabin, but the person was gone by the time they arrived. He said it looked like they had left recently, maybe within the last few hours, maybe even while I was driving out. He told me this kind of thing wasn't unheard of. People hiding in remote areas, squatters, runaways, sometimes just people trying to disappear. But the way he said it, there was something in his face, like he didn't want to say more. I never went back to that cabin. I never found out who that person was or how long they had been under my floor. But I think about it all the time, especially at night, when I wake up and think I hear something moving below me. Story continues in the next message due to length. I changed after that. Even back in the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had watched me, had been close to me, that they knew my habits, my routines, that they watched me make coffee in the morning, that they heard me walking barefoot across the cabin floor, that they listened to me breathe while I slept on the couch. For how long? I'll never know. I started locking every door and window at home, double-checking them at night. I set up motion lights outside my apartment. I began waking up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, listening for sounds that weren't there. I developed a habit of glancing under furniture, behind curtains, under my bed. My friends noticed I seemed distracted, nervous. I lied and said I was just busy. But the truth was, I rented a cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota for 3 weeks to work on a writing project that was way overdue. It wasn't one of those cozy vacation cabins with neighbors nearby or shops within walking distance. This one was isolated, 12 miles off a gravel road, then another mile up a dirt path that barely counted as a driveway. It didn't even have a mailbox or street sign. The owner gave me GPS coordinates, and even then, I almost missed it the first time. That's how far out it was. The cabin was old but solid. No fancy design, just a single floor, a small kitchen, a basic bathroom, a living space with a table and couch, and one bedroom. There was a porch that wrapped around 2 sides, and the whole place sat surrounded by thick pine forest with no other buildings in sight. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, no landline. Just a propane tank, a wood-burning stove, solar panels for minimal power, and a backup gas generator. I needed that kind of isolation. I had 2.5 weeks left to turn in something that should have been finished 3 months ago. I told everyone I was going off-grid to focus. That was true. I didn't tell them how burned out I'd been, how little progress I'd made, or how badly I needed to get out of my apartment. The first day went smooth. I unpacked everything, mostly groceries, my laptop, a hard drive, and some clothes. I swept out the cabin even though it was already clean. I stacked some firewood by the door, tested the solar system, filled the water tank from the rain barrel outside, and made myself some eggs on the propane stove. By sunset, I was sitting on the porch with my laptop, looking out at the tree line with a cup of coffee, feeling like this trip was exactly what I needed. The next few days followed a slow rhythm. I woke up early, made breakfast, worked from about 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. with breaks in between. I'd sit outside and write or think, sometimes hike around the cabin. It was peaceful, quiet in a way I didn't know I had missed. No cars, no phones, just the wind in the trees and birds overhead. Occasionally I'd hear something rustle in the brush, maybe a rabbit or a deer, but nothing unusual. At night, I'd make something simple for dinner, light a fire, read, and sleep early. By the 5th day, I started feeling an itch. Not paranoia, more like curiosity. There was a faint trail behind the cabin that I hadn't explored yet. It was overgrown and looked like it hadn't been used in years. You could tell it wasn't part of any official hiking path. But it led somewhere. I could see the trail bend and disappear between the trees. I figured if I followed it for a while, I'd find a stream or a clearing, maybe even a view. I put on hiking boots and took a bottle of water, a compass, and a folding knife just in case. It was late morning. I told myself I'd follow the trail for an hour, then head back to write. The trail twisted through the woods for maybe 30 minutes before opening up into a flat clearing, roughly 50 feet across. It was surrounded by tall trees, but the space itself was dead flat, covered in moss and pine needles. There were no animal prints, no signs of recent life, no trash or fire pits or tire tracks. Just open space with a strange feeling to it. Not creepy, but still. Something about how silent it was made me pause. In the middle of the clearing was a rectangular patch of disturbed dirt, maybe 8 feet long and 4 feet wide. Something had been dug up and recovered. The soil was fresher than the rest of the clearing, darker and loose, with no growth on it. I thought it might have been a fire pit or even a place someone buried trash. I didn't touch it the first time. I walked a slow circle around the clearing, looked at the edges for any signs, footprints, broken branches, anything, but saw nothing. After a few minutes, I turned back and headed to the cabin, brushing it off. That night, I kept thinking about the patch of dirt. I told myself it was probably nothing, just someone's old camp. Maybe they buried food waste or built something temporary and took it down. But the shape of it, long and narrow and deep-looking, stuck in my head. It didn't look like a trash pit. The next morning, I brought a shovel. I hiked back out earlier this time, maybe 9 a.m. The air was crisp, and the clearing looked exactly the same. I felt strange standing in front of that patch of soil. For a minute, I considered turning around and leaving it alone. But I knelt down and started digging. The soil came up easy. It was fresh, dug maybe weeks ago, maybe less. A few feet down, the smell changed. damp and sour. I paused, poked at the next layer, and found something hard. It was a plastic sheet, thick like a tarp, folded around something. I worked the edges loose, brushing dirt off with my hands. The smell hit harder, like rot. I backed up, breathing through my shirt, then stepped forward again and pulled more of the sheet up. Inside was a plastic duffel bag, duct-taped shut, about 3 feet long. It was heavy when I lifted one end. I didn't open it right away. I just stood there for a long time, staring at the shape of it. There was no question in my mind what it looked like. I dropped the shovel and backed away. I left the hole as it was, hiked straight back to the cabin, locked the door, and sat inside for the rest of the day, not working, barely moving, just thinking. There was no cell service, no phone, no internet. If I wanted to contact anyone, I'd have to drive 15 miles back to the nearest gas station, maybe more. The owner of the cabin lived out of state. I had no neighbors. No one knew where I was. Besides one friend I told I'd be off the grid. I didn't tell them where the cabin was. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that bag. What if it was an animal? What if it was just trash and I was overreacting? But that wasn't what it felt like. The shape, the weight, the way it was wrapped. Something about it told me not to dismiss it. I waited until morning. Around 7 a.m., I made coffee and stood at the window, watching the woods. It was cloudy, colder. I thought about driving to town, but something made me want to go back and look again. I wanted to be sure. I hiked back out with gloves this time and a flashlight in my backpack. When I reached the clearing, everything was how I left it. The hole was there, the tarp still inside. I climbed down again, pulled the duffel bag out, and laid it on the moss. I cut the tape slowly with my knife. Inside were clothes, jeans, a flannel, socks, folded tight. Under that, more plastic, this time black. I peeled it back and stopped. There was hair, dark brown, human, matted down against pale skin. I didn't uncover the whole thing. I saw enough. I wrapped it back up, dropped the tarp in the hole, and covered it again with dirt. I stomped it flat, brushed pine needles back over the top, and left. My mind was racing the whole way back to the cabin. I kept glancing into the woods, expecting something or someone to appear, but nothing did. Back at the cabin, I packed my things fast. I left all the food, some clothes, even my tools. I just grabbed my laptop, the hard drive, my wallet, and got in the truck. The dirt road felt longer than before. Every bend in the trees made me grip the wheel tighter. I thought I heard a noise at one point, branches snapping, and hit the gas. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. At the first gas station, I used the payphone to call the sheriff's office. I didn't use my name. I gave them the coordinates, told them what I found, and hung up. I didn't go back. A few days later, I saw the story online. Human remains found in remote area of Chippewa National Forest. No details, just that a body had been discovered. Investigation ongoing. No suspects. I never told anyone I was the one who found it. I finished my project in a motel room 2 states away. Sometimes I still think about that clearing, about who put the body there, how recent it was, and if they knew someone might find it. I wonder if anyone ever saw me at that cabin. If anyone had been watching, maybe they were planning to come back. But I left before they could, and I never went back. I had been doing solo trips into the woods since I was in college. It started with short weekend hikes, then a few nights in a tent, and eventually I got comfortable enough to rent cabins far from towns, far from roads, and deep in places where phone signals didn't reach. I liked the silence, the distance, the lack of people. There was something in the stillness of the woods that made me feel clear-headed. Life in the city was loud, fast, and full of clutter. Out here, I could hear my thoughts better. It was a break from everyone and everything. That was the reason I went out there. I didn't want distractions. I didn't want anyone bothering me. The cabin I rented that time was near the northern edge of a national forest. It wasn't one of those polished Airbnbs people rent for vacation. It was old. No paint on the outside, just dry gray wood. The roof looked like it had been repaired at least 10 different ways. No proper road reached it. You had to park half a mile away at a gravel pull-off, then walk down a barely visible path that twisted through thick pine woods and dropped down into a narrow valley where the trees thickened and closed overhead. The cabin sat at the far end of that valley. A stream curved behind it, and the land rose up into a small ridge that blocked any sight of the sky in one direction. The place had no electricity. The person who owned it installed a propane stove and a small tank, and there was a rusty old fireplace that hadn't been cleaned in years. There was no running water. The guy had set up a big blue barrel to collect rain off the roof and told me to boil anything I planned to drink. The outhouse sat about 20 yards from the back of the cabin, tucked just inside the tree line. It was exactly the kind of place I liked. Quiet, remote, a little bit rough. I got there on a Monday, early June. My plan was to stay for 4 nights and leave Friday morning. I packed enough food for a week just in case. Canned beans, rice, oatmeal, and some freeze-dried meals. I brought a small water filter and a little pot to boil water on the stove. I carried a heavy sleeping bag, 2 flashlights with fresh batteries, a folding knife, a journal, a book to read, and a small solar panel to keep my phone charged, though I had no signal once I went deeper than the first ridge. The first day was fine. The weather was warm but not hot, and the sun filtered through the trees in soft patches of yellow. I dropped my bag inside, checked for spiders, rats, or any other squatters, and then swept out the dust with an old broom I found by the door. I didn't do much else that day. Cooked some rice and canned chili on the propane burner, wrote a bit in my notebook, and just sat outside until the sun dropped behind the trees. That night, I slept hard. I didn't even hear the wind. The second day was when I noticed things that felt off. Nothing serious at first. I was walking along the stream behind the cabin, just exploring the area, when I found a boot. Not a pair, just one. It was half buried in the mud near a bend in the stream. Faded brown leather, torn along one side, and full of water. It looked old. Not ancient, but not fresh either. Maybe a year or 2 sitting out there. I thought someone might have lost it during a hike, or maybe it washed downstream during a flood. I pulled it out and set it on a rock, then kept walking. That evening, I went a little farther upstream and found something else. A plastic water bottle stuck in the roots of a fallen tree. The label was faded, but it looked like one of those cheap ones you buy at gas stations. It didn't seem that old, just sun-bleached. I started to wonder if people came through this valley more often than I thought. Maybe hunters or other campers, maybe even squatters. I kept those thoughts in the back of my head. That night, I lit a small fire in the old pit outside the cabin. Just a few logs. The air had cooled down and I wanted the light more than the heat. I sat on a log and ate some cold beans straight from the can, watching the smoke drift into the sky. The woods were still. I couldn't hear anything but the stream and the occasional creak of tree branches moving overhead. But after a while, I thought I heard something else. Something lighter, almost like footsteps in dry leaves. I turned my head toward the trees behind the outhouse and stared for a long time. There was nothing there. I listened harder, but it didn't come again. After maybe 20 minutes, I doused the fire and went inside. I slept less soundly that night. A few times I woke up, not because of a noise, but because I felt like something was different. The air in the room felt too quiet. I sat up once, turned on my flashlight, and swept it around the inside of the cabin. Just shadows, dust, and the dull wood walls. I told myself I was just overthinking things. I'd been alone too long. It happens. The third day, I decided to go farther out and see if there were any trails leading out of the valley. I followed the stream north until the valley ended in a steep slope, then climbed up the ridge to the west. The woods were thicker up there, and the ground was rough with fallen trees and brambles everywhere. After about 2 hours, I realized I was circling back down toward the valley again, just on the other side. There were no trails, no signs anyone had been there in a long time. That's when I noticed something strange again. A tree, an old birch, had carvings in it. Not initials or anything like that, just slashes. 5 of them, long and deep. They weren't natural. They were made by a knife or some sharp tool. They looked old, the edges smoothed by rain and weather, but they were definitely man-made. I stared at them for a while, then turned around and went back down the slope. When I reached the cabin again, I saw something that made my stomach drop a little. The boot I had found the day before, the one I set on the rock by the stream, was now sitting on the porch. I hadn't brought it there. I was sure of it. I had left it near the stream. Now it was right next to the door. I stood still for a long time, just staring at it. I didn't move. I listened, but I didn't hear anything. Then I slowly walked up, picked up the boot, and set it on the edge of the porch again, right under the window. I went inside, closed the door, and locked it with the little metal latch. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in my bag, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other. Every time a branch snapped outside, I froze. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like footsteps again. Slow, unsteady, on leaves, not running, not animal sounds. Something heavy stepping lightly, like it was trying not to be heard. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe too loud. After a few minutes, it stopped. I don't know how long I lay there. Maybe an hour, maybe more. I must have fallen asleep sometime near dawn. When I woke up, the first thing I did was check the porch. The boot was gone. I walked around the cabin. Nothing seemed disturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, that I wasn't alone out there. That day, I stayed close. I didn't go walking. I didn't want to leave the cabin. I felt trapped, but I didn't want to be out in the woods if someone or something was out there. I spent the day boiling water, eating slowly, writing a little in my journal, and staring at the trees. My phone still had no signal. I checked it every hour just in case. That night, I locked the door and wedged a heavy chair against it. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want anyone knowing I was in there. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again, closer this time, right outside the window. I turned off my flashlight and crouched down behind the bed, gripping the knife. Then came the sound of breathing, not animal breathing, human, slow and steady, just on the other side of the wall. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Then I heard the porch creak. Something stepped up onto it. Slow, cautious. The handle on the door rattled once, twice. Then it stopped. After a long silence, I heard the footsteps retreat. I didn't sleep. When morning came, I opened the door. There were footprints in the dirt. Human footprints. Bare feet. No boots. Just deep imprints in the soft earth. They circled the cabin, went to the window, to the outhouse, and back to the woods. I packed my bag in 5 minutes. I didn't care that I had one more night left. I grabbed everything I could carry, slung it over my shoulder, and started walking. I didn't run. I didn't look back. I walked steady, fast, and silent, back along the path through the woods. I didn't stop until I reached my car. When I got in and turned the engine, I felt like I was about to cry. I locked the doors and drove, gripping the wheel so tight my hands hurt. I didn't relax until I saw power lines and cell towers again. That night, in a cheap motel in the nearest town, I took a hot shower and sat on the bed for a long time. I tried to make sense of what happened. There were no answers, just questions. Who was out there? Why were they barefoot? Why didn't they try to hurt me? Why did they just walk around the cabin and breathe at the window? I never went back. I reported it to the guy who owned the cabin. He didn't seem surprised. He just said, "Yeah, the last renter left early too. That was the last solo trip I ever took." I still think about that place. I still wonder if whoever or whatever I didn't even want to be there in the first place. The whole idea of staying alone in a remote cabin for a full week sounded good in theory when I was sitting at my desk in the city, tired of deadlines, sick of the noise, and desperate to unplug. But once I got up there, once the silence stretched longer than I expected, and the woods seemed deeper than I imagined, everything started to feel different. The cabin was something I found online, one of those rustic rentals with no electricity, no running water, and miles from the nearest paved road. It was located in a quiet pocket of northern Minnesota, near a frozen lake and surrounded by thick pine forests. The photos made it look peaceful, small, quaint, cozy, even. I got there on a Sunday afternoon. It was late January, and the sun was already dropping fast. Snow covered most of the ground but hadn't fallen fresh in a few days, so it had that slightly dirty, crusted over look. My car barely made it up the unplowed road. The last half mile I had to walk, dragging a sled with my gear across the packed snow trail that led to the cabin. My boots sank slightly, but not too much. The cold made my cheeks sting, but it wasn't unbearable. By the time I got to the cabin, the sky was turning a soft blue-gray, that eerie winter color that always makes you feel like everything's about to go quiet. The place was smaller than it looked in the pictures, just one room with a wood stove, a bunk bed, a foldable table, and a few shelves nailed to the wall. No bathroom, just an outhouse maybe 20 yards into the trees. It smelled like old pine and soot and something metallic like rust or dried blood, but I figured it was just the stovepipe or the iron hinges on the door. I started a fire right away, stacked the rest of my gear in the corner, and boiled some water on a small propane burner I'd brought. There was no phone signal, of course. I expected that. I didn't bring a satellite phone either. I figured I'd be okay for a week. I had everything planned: food, water, extra clothes, plenty of firewood, even a journal. I wanted quiet, solitude. That's what I kept telling myself, even as something in my gut kept whispering that something about this place felt off. The first night was uneventful. I was tired from the drive and the hike in, so I passed out early. The bunk bed creaked every time I shifted, and the wind outside moaned through the trees. It wasn't scary, just different. By the second day, I started to get a feel for the area. There was a frozen lake maybe half a mile from the cabin. I found it during a morning walk, and the view was stunning. Flat white snow stretched across the ice, and the tree line in the distance looked black and sharp, like a painting. I stood there for a while, not thinking about anything, just breathing. Felt good. That night, something strange happened. Around midnight, I woke up for no reason. I wasn't cold. The fire was still smoldering, and the cabin was warm enough. But I had that feeling, the one that creeps in from nowhere, the one you get when someone is staring at you. I sat up on the bunk, and it took me a moment to realize what was bothering me. The wind had stopped, completely, no sound at all. Even the trees outside weren't making noise. It was too quiet. I listened for a while, maybe 2 or 3 minutes. Then, just when I started to relax, I heard a sound. It was faint, far off. It sounded like a foot dragging through snow. Not fast, just slow and steady. Then another, and another. It wasn't an animal. I've heard deer before. This wasn't that. It sounded too heavy, too methodical, and it stopped just as suddenly as it started. I stayed awake for the next 2 hours, staring at the door. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just watched and waited, trying to convince myself it was nothing. In the morning, I walked outside and checked the snow. There was nothing. No tracks. Not even mine from the day before. Wind must have blown everything over during the night, or maybe I had just imagined the whole thing. But I started paying closer attention after that. By day 4, I started noticing other little things. The firewood I'd stacked outside the cabin was moved slightly. Not much, just a few pieces shifted from where I'd left them. Then the water jug I had sitting on the porch, one of those big blue camping jugs with a spout, had been turned around like someone spun it in place. There was no reason I would have done that. I started double-checking everything. I'd count how many steps it took from the cabin to the outhouse, how many logs were in the woodpile, how many cans of food I had on the shelf. I started locking the cabin door from the inside using a small metal latch that came pre-installed. Even though I was in the middle of nowhere, I didn't feel alone anymore. The worst part came the night of the 5th day. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again, and this time I knew something was outside. I didn't hear it first, I felt it, like the air in the cabin got heavier. I climbed down from the bunk slowly and stepped over to the window. There was no curtain, just frost and condensation on the inside of the glass. I wiped a small patch with the sleeve of my sweatshirt and looked out into the dark. There was someone standing at the tree line. Not close, maybe 50 feet out. Not moving, just standing perfectly still, facing the cabin. I could barely make out the shape. Person, tall, No flashlight, no headlamp, no movement. They stood there like they had been waiting for hours, like they didn't care I saw them. I blinked and looked again. Still there. I backed away from the window slowly, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't have a gun, just a hatchet and a heavy flashlight. My phone was useless. No signal, no help. I sat on the edge of the bunk for hours, gripping the flashlight with both hands and staring at the door. I didn't dare fall asleep. Around 4:30 a.m., when the first signs of dawn started to glow on the snow outside, I peeked through the window again. He was gone. That morning I found tracks in the snow. Human footprints, clear as day, leading from the trees to the edge of the clearing where the cabin sat. Then they stopped. Just stopped. No return trail. No sign of turning around. Like whoever it was just disappeared. I didn't leave the cabin at all that day. I sat inside, every sound outside sending jolts through my body. I kept the fire going, kept the flashlight within arm's reach, and barely touched my food. My stomach was twisted tight the entire time. When the sun went down, I locked the door again and pushed the heavy table in front of it. I didn't sleep that night at all. On the 6th day, I snapped. I packed up everything I could in under 10 minutes, grabbed the sled, and headed back toward the road. I didn't care how far it was. I didn't care about the cold. I just needed to get out. The forest felt different that day. Every sound felt closer, louder. At one point, I thought I saw someone step behind a tree, way off in the distance. I didn't stop. I kept going, pulling the sled, stumbling, sweating even though it was freezing out. When I finally got to where the car was parked, I found it exactly how I left it. But on the back window, written in the frost, were 3 letters, "Run," just like that. No footprints, no tire tracks, no other marks in the snow, just those 3 letters. I didn't stop. I got in the car, started it, and drove until I reached the nearest town 2 hours away. I stayed at a cheap motel that night. I locked the door, pushed the dresser in front of it, and slept with the lights on. I didn't even check out the next morning. I just left the key on the bed and walked out. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not really. If I tried, they'd say I was just paranoid, that isolation messes with your head. Maybe they're right. Maybe I imagined it. But I know what I saw. I know the man at the tree line was real. I know the tracks in the snow were real. I know those 3 letters were there. Whoever was out there didn't want to hurt me. Not yet. They just wanted me to know they were watching. And I know they'll always know where to find me now. I needed a break. That's how it started. Life had gotten a little too fast, a little too loud, and I wanted out, just for a while. My job wasn't killing me, but it was close. I was behind on everything, my sleep, my bills, my plans. I wasn't talking to anyone, not really, and I couldn't remember the last time I had a full day where I didn't feel like I was crawling up the side of a steep hill with no top. So I booked a cabin. I wanted something simple, not a resort cabin with cable and a gift shop. I wanted something real, something still standing from decades ago, something that didn't care what I thought of it. I found one on a small site that listed old private rentals in rural parts of the state. It was in the northern woods, about 4 hours away, completely isolated. It was listed as fully off-grid, which meant no power, no water, no Wi-Fi, no cell signal. It had a wood stove, a well, a single cot, and enough propane to cook if I wanted to. That's all I needed. I packed light. A few clothes, food for a week, 2 large jugs of water, a hunting knife I'd never used, some flashlights with extra batteries, and a notebook. I didn't plan on writing in it. I just liked having it around. Felt old school. Felt quiet. The drive out was long and mostly empty. Towns got smaller and further apart. The last 30 miles were all dirt road. My GPS stopped updating a few miles before I reached the turnoff. I drove up a narrow, winding path through thick trees, and when I finally saw the cabin, it looked even more rugged than I expected. Just one small structure, barely bigger than a shed, made from gray logs that had clearly aged with time. The porch sagged in the middle. The roof leaned a bit to one side. There was a stone chimney poking out the top. The forest around it was dense and dark and silent. That first night was peaceful. I lit a small fire in the stove to take the edge off the cold and heated up some canned chili. I had brought a battery-powered lantern, which I kept next to the cot while I read a little from an old paperback I found inside the cabin. I heard wind in the trees. Nothing else. No cars. No people. Not even birds. That kind of silence takes some getting used to. It's not like the kind you get with earplugs. It's like the world has been turned off, and all you can hear is yourself breathing. On the second day, I decided to hike a bit around the area. There were no trails, just woods going in every direction. The trees were a mix of thick pine and tall birch, and there was moss and old fallen branches all over the forest floor. It was quiet, but not in a creepy way. More like the woods were too old to bother making noise. I wandered maybe a mile out, circling the cabin from different angles, just to get familiar with where I was. The last thing I wanted was to get lost. On the third day, something caught my eye. I was walking maybe 500 yards southeast of the cabin, moving slowly through a thinner part of the forest, when I saw a patch of disturbed earth. It was about the size of a kitchen table, with the dirt uneven and cracked like someone had been digging. There was no shovel or anything around, but it didn't look like an animal hole. It looked like someone had dug something up, then pushed the dirt back down roughly. The soil was darker than the area around it, like it had been wet not too long ago. I stood there for a while, just staring at it. I didn't know why it unsettled me. It was just a patch of dirt, but something about the way it looked, it didn't belong. Like it had a story behind it, and I wasn't supposed to know that story. I came back to it the next day. I brought a small camping shovel I had kept in my car. I don't know what I thought I'd find. Maybe nothing. Maybe just a root or a rock or someone's trash from years ago. But I needed to know. The digging took longer than I expected. The soil was packed tight under the surface. I got about 2 feet down before I hit something hard. It was metal. I scraped away the dirt carefully until I saw what it was. A box, about the size of a microwave. Old, rusty, but solid. It had a handle, and when I pulled it, the box lifted out heavy like it was full. I brought it back to the cabin because the light was starting to fade. I didn't open it right away. I just stared at it for a while, sitting on the porch with the box between my feet, the trees swaying slowly in the evening wind. I felt something sharp in my chest. Not fear, not yet, just unease, like I had crossed a line without knowing it. I opened it later that night. Inside, wrapped in thick plastic, were dozens of photos. Old, yellowed photos. All of them showed people. Not family pictures. Not vacations. These were black and white photos of people standing in the woods. Not smiling. Just staring at the camera. Some were in winter coats. Some were shirtless like it was summer. All of them looked dirty. Tired. Some were barefoot. Some looked like they had been crying. There were names written on the back of some. Dates too. Most of them were from the 70s and 80s. One of the oldest ones said 1963. And under the photos there were papers. Dozens of them. Handwritten notes. Lists. Descriptions. Coordinates. A few had fingerprints on them. One page had a crude map with X marks all around the area where I was staying. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up reading every page. They were written by someone who had been watching people, tracking them, writing down what they wore, where they camped, what they ate. Some entries had times. For 12 p.m., left tent for water. 7:18 p.m., returned from East Ridge. Slept at 9:50 p.m. One paper said, buried May 4th. No ID male, 20s, possible runaway. That was the only one that mentioned anything about a body. I didn't go back to that spot again. The next few days, I tried to act like everything was fine. I went through the motions, ate, walked, sat outside, but I kept hearing things. Nothing loud, just subtle things. A stick breaking, a shuffle of leaves, a metallic tap, like something brushing up against a piece of iron. I kept the box locked in the trunk of my car, but I felt like its weight was still in the cabin with me. On the 6th night, I woke up at around 2 a.m. I didn't know what woke me, but I felt cold, like a draft had gotten in. I sat up and grabbed the flashlight. The cabin door was slightly open. I know I had locked it. I double-checked every night. I got up slowly and moved to the door. There were no footprints outside. No sign of anyone or anything. Just wind moving through the branches above. The ground was too dry to hold a print anyway. But something didn't feel right. I stayed up the rest of the night with the flashlight on and the knife in my hand. In the morning, I found something new. Not far from the cabin, maybe 30 feet behind it, I saw a small pile of rocks that hadn't been there before. 5 rocks stacked neatly, like a marker. I didn't touch them. I packed everything. I didn't care that I had a day left. I loaded my gear, locked the cabin, and drove out. I didn't stop until I hit paved road again. Back in the city, I didn't talk to anyone about it. I kept thinking about the photos, the box, the notes, who took them, who wrote them. I thought about the coordinates, and if any of them had been near my cabin. I thought about the fact that someone must have buried that box not long before I found it. The dirt was too fresh. I thought about the door being open. A few weeks later, I went to a library that had archives of old missing person reports. I don't know what I was looking for. Maybe one of the names on the photos. Maybe something to explain what I saw. I didn't find anything exact, but I found patterns. People who went missing in the woods up north. Hikers, campers, mostly alone. A few in pairs. Dozens of them over 30 years. No trace found. No gear recovered. Just vanished. I thought about the stack of rocks. I thought about the photo labeled, "Buried May 4th." I didn't tell the police. I didn't know what I would say. I found a box in the woods with old photos and creepy notes. They'd think I was nuts. Or worse, they'd ask why I took it instead of reporting it. Sometimes I dream about those photos now. About the people in them. Just standing there, alone in the woods, staring back at the camera. Like they knew they were being watched. Like they were waiting for something to happen. I've moved since then. New apartment. New job. I sleep with the windows locked and a flashlight by the bed. I still have the box. I thought about throwing it away, or burying it again, or even burning it. But part of me can't let it go. Like I owe it to those people in the pictures. Like if I get rid of it, their stories vanish for good. Sometimes I wonder if the person who buried it knew someone might find it. If maybe they wanted it found. Or if maybe I was just unlucky. Maybe I was too curious. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I don't think I ever will. But I still think about the door being open. And I still wonder if I was really alone out there. I wasn't planning to stay at that cabin. I just wanted to make it across the pass before the snow got worse. But sometimes it doesn't matter what you plan. Things get ahead of you, and when you're deep in the woods, far from the main roads, what's around you becomes your whole world. You don't think about the rest of the map anymore. It was late October when I left the town of Whiteford with my truck packed. I was heading across the mountains to meet my cousin on the other side for a hunting trip. We'd been planning it for months. The snow was coming early that year, and I wanted to make it across the back road before the pass closed. The highway was open, but the back road cut 4 hours off the trip, and I'd driven it a few times before. It twisted through the forest, climbed slow, and eventually passed through a narrow mountain gap before dropping down into the wide valley on the other side. It was quiet and remote, but I liked that kind of drive. I had food, water, tools, full tank of gas, chains, and good tires. I left just after lunch, figuring I'd get across the hard part before dark. If it slowed too much, I had my sleeping bag. I wasn't worried. About 40 miles past the last small town, the road narrowed and the trees thickened. The snow on the ground got deeper as I climbed, and tire tracks in front of me slowly faded. It was just me up there now. The wind picked up in spots, shaking the tall pines around me. I had the heater going and a thermos of hot coffee in the cup holder. The road wasn't plowed, but it was still passable. I had the chains in back, but I didn't stop to put them on. I didn't want to lose time. I just slowed down and kept going. Then I came around a bend and saw it. A rock slide had taken out the road. Not just some fallen branches or loose gravel, I mean big, jagged boulders spread right across the road, stretching from one end to the other. Some of them were the size of kitchen tables. There was no way around. The cliff edge dropped off on one side, and a steep slope went up the other. It didn't look fresh either. Snow had settled on top. No one had cleared it. I stopped the truck and stared at it for a while, like maybe the rocks would move if I waited long enough. But they didn't. I put the truck in reverse and backed up slowly to a wide pullout I'd passed about a quarter-mile back. It wasn't much, just a flat shoulder with enough room to park and turn around. But as soon as I turned the wheel, I felt the tires sink. The snow looked soft, but it was hiding a patch of mud under it. Maybe a little thaw and freeze from the sun earlier. The tires spun. I let off, shifted into low gear, and tried again. They spun again. I tried rocking it forward and backward, but it only dug deeper. After 10 minutes, I gave up. I got out and looked at the tires. The rear ones were sunk halfway into the ruts. Snow and mud packed around them. The front ones weren't much better. I had no traction. It was going to take shoveling and chains, maybe some time with the jack. I didn't want to be doing that in the dark. I climbed back in and checked my phone. No bars. That didn't surprise me. There wasn't signal up here most of the time. I had two choices: sleep in the truck and try again in the morning, or start walking and see what I could find. I chose to walk. I grabbed my coat, gloves, flashlight, and a pack with some food and water, locked the truck behind me, and started back down the road. I figured maybe I'd pass a ranger cabin or a hunting shack, maybe someone else who got stuck. I knew there were old structures up in the woods off the road. Some were even on maps marked from logging days. After about an hour of walking, I saw the trail. It was overgrown and thin, not used in a long time, but it curved off the road into the trees. There was an old wooden sign nailed to a post, half covered in snow and moss. I brushed it off. All it said was Greer Cabin 1 miles. That was enough for me. The trail climbed uphill through thick pine forest. The snow here was softer, untouched. The wind howled through the trees above, and now and then, clumps of snow dropped down from the branches. I kept walking. The light was fading, and the cold was creeping into my legs. I saw the cabin through the trees just before full dark. It sat on a slight rise, old and gray, with a small porch and one broken shutter hanging loose. Smoke hadn't come from the chimney in years, but the roof was still intact. I climbed the steps and tried the door. It opened with a stiff creak. Inside, it was musty and dark. The smell of old wood, dried dirt, and dust filled my nose. I shined the flashlight around. The place was empty. One table, 2 chairs, a cold fireplace, and a metal cot in the corner with no mattress. Spider webs in the corners, rat droppings in places, but the walls were solid and the roof didn't leak. I closed the door and latched it. My breath fogged in the beam of the light. I unrolled my sleeping bag, sat on the floor, and had a protein bar and some water. My boots were wet. I took them off and rubbed my feet to get the blood moving again. That night, the wind roared through the trees outside. The cabin groaned once or twice, like the logs were shifting. Couldn't sleep much. Every sound made me lift my head. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps crunching in the snow outside, but when I sat up and listened, it was gone. In the morning, I went outside and looked around. The trail was covered again like no one had walked it. I didn't see tracks, not even animals. It was cold, and a few new inches of snow had fallen. I thought about heading back to the truck, but I didn't want to leave the cabin yet. I needed a plan. I needed to figure out how to dig the truck out without freezing, or maybe follow the road all the way back toward town. I spent the next few hours gathering wood and breaking ice off the small stream I found nearby. I boiled some water using a rusty tin pot I found in the fireplace ashes. There was a dry pile of logs under the porch. I built a fire. The warmth helped. That's when I noticed something strange. There were boot prints near the back of the cabin. Not mine. I had only walked out the front. These came from the woods behind the cabin and stopped near the back wall. Then nothing. No prints going away. Just a few deep impressions in the snow, like someone had been standing there for a while. I walked around the cabin again. No other signs, just those prints half filled in by wind now. That night, I made sure to bolt the door. I kept the fire low. I barely slept. I thought I heard something again, something brushing against the wall outside, but it never knocked, never spoke, never showed itself. Just a slow, dragging sound once, like something heavy being pulled over snow. On the third day, I hiked back to the truck. It was exactly how I left it, buried deeper now. I started digging out the tires, worked for an hour, got the chains on, and tried again. Still wouldn't move. The front wheels had sunk too far. I needed traction boards or a tow, and I had neither. I slammed the door in frustration and sat in the driver's seat, breathing into my hands. Then I noticed something new. On the windshield, right in the middle, someone had wiped a line through the frost. Not a word, not a message, just a single straight finger line, drawn across like someone clearing their view. I hadn't done that, and the doors were locked when I returned. I stood outside in the road, turning in a circle, staring into the trees. It was silent. I didn't hear birds or animals or anything, just the wind through the branches. I hiked back to the cabin that evening, feeling eyes on me the whole way. The fourth day, I didn't leave the cabin. I stayed inside, kept the fire going, and sharpened my camping knife. I made sure my hatchet was within reach. I listened for hours. Snow fell steady all day. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up with my back to the wall and flashlight in hand. At some point around 3 a.m., I heard breathing outside. Not wind, not animal, human breathing. It was soft and slow, like someone standing close to the wall, like someone leaning near the wood, just outside. Then it stopped. Nothing after that. In the morning, I found more prints in the snow around the cabin, this time circling it, like someone walking around and around during the night. I checked my gear. Nothing was missing, but my backpack had been unzipped. The fifth day, I decided I had to leave. I packed everything, left most of the food behind to travel light. I wasn't going back to the truck. I was going to walk the road all the way back toward town if I had to. It would take hours, maybe all day, but I had no choice. I couldn't stay in that cabin again. I couldn't wait for whoever or whatever was watching me. I made it about 6 miles before I saw the footprints. Not mine. Coming from the trees, cutting across the road ahead of me. 2 sets. One barefoot, one with boots. I froze. I stared at them for 10 minutes straight, standing there in the snow, heart pounding. The tracks went off into the trees again. I turned around. I didn't want to pass them. I went back toward the cabin. When I got there, I found the door wide open. Everything inside had been moved. My sleeping bag was gone. The tin I had been needing a break for a while. Things at work were just too much. The emails wouldn't stop, the deadlines never gave me time to breathe, and even though I worked from home, it somehow made everything worse. I couldn't disconnect from anything. My apartment felt more like a box I was locked in than a place to live. I wasn't sleeping well. I was grinding my teeth at night. I was getting sick every other week. One evening, I stood in the shower with the water running too hot and I didn't move for maybe half an hour. That's when I knew I had to get away. Not for a weekend, not for just 1 or 2 nights. I needed a solid week, by myself with no phones, no internet, and no people. So I started looking online. At first, I searched for Airbnbs close to town, but I kept seeing the same modern, clean places that looked like someone had designed them for social media photos. That wasn't what I wanted. I didn't want to sit in another perfect apartment and pretend I was calm. I wanted a place that made me forget the world. Something old, something with dust in the corners and creaky floors. I didn't want a pool or a hot tub or a giant TV. I wanted a place where I could sit on a wooden chair, stare at trees, and hear my own thoughts for once. I ended up finding a listing on an older rental site, one of those places that hadn't been updated in years. The photos were grainy and from a flip phone or something, but it was perfect. A small one-room cabin deep in the woods, no Wi-Fi, no phone reception, just a well, a wood stove, and a propane lantern. It wasn't too expensive either. The owner's description said it was about 4 miles from the nearest gravel road. accessible only by a narrow trail. They said they would leave the key under a rock by the door. No check-in, no paperwork, no need to meet anyone. Just get there, lock the door, and disappear for as long as you need. I booked it for 9 nights. I drove out early in the morning. I packed light, just canned food, a sleeping bag, a few extra clothes, a knife, a flashlight, and some paperback books. I brought my phone too, but I turned it off as soon as I left the last stretch of paved road. I wanted this to be real, just me and the woods. I parked my car where the directions said to, near a rusty old gate chained open beside a fading sign that had no words left on it. I slung my backpack over my shoulder and started walking. The trail was narrow and rough. It had been used at some point, but not recently. Pine needles covered most of it, and fallen branches crisscrossed parts of the path. The silence was heavy, not just quiet, *heavy star. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots and the occasional flutter of birds flying away when I got too close. I hiked for nearly an hour before I finally saw the cabin. It was smaller than I expected. Dark brown wood, the roof slanted with moss hanging over the edge. There were 2 windows in front, but the glass looked fogged up and dirty. The door had a large rusted latch and a wooden step that sagged when I stepped on it. Just like the instructions said, the key was under a flat rock on the left side of the step. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like dust and old wood, but not in a bad way. It was a dry smell, clean in its own way. There was a wood-burning stove in the corner with a small pile of firewood stacked beside it. Against one wall was a cot with a thin mattress that had a rolled-up wool blanket on top. A small table and a single chair sat near the window. There were shelves with some basics, matches, candles, a metal pot, some pans. A jug of water sat by the door. It was exactly what I needed. No frills, no noise. That first night, I sat outside until the sun dropped behind the trees. I didn't hear a single car or voice or anything that reminded me of the city. Just wind and leaves and the slow creaking of the trees. I read for a bit by lantern light, then crawled into the cot and fell asleep before I could even think. The days passed slowly, which was what I wanted. I didn't keep track of time. I woke up with the sun, made simple food, gathered more firewood, walked short distances from the cabin, read, and just sat for hours doing nothing. I left my phone off. I didn't write anything down. I let myself be blank. Felt good. But around the 4th day, something started to feel different. It wasn't anything big at first. I just noticed that some things weren't exactly where I'd left them. I remembered clearly putting my flashlight on the windowsill at night, but in the morning it was on the table. I thought maybe I moved it and forgot. Then I noticed that one of the matches I'd left unburned was broken in half, though I never touched it. One night I woke up and thought I heard soft crunching outside, like someone walking slowly across dry needles. I stared at the ceiling and told myself it was just an animal. But I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By the 6th day, I was starting to feel uncomfortable. When I walked a few hundred yards from the cabin, I kept feeling like someone was behind me. I'd stop, listen, and there'd be nothing. Then when I started walking again, I'd hear another faint crunch. I turned sharply once, expecting to see a deer or even another person, but the woods were still. I hurried back to the cabin and locked the door behind me, even though there was no one for miles, supposedly. Later that afternoon, I noticed something new. On the edge of the trail that led away from the cabin, just before the trees got thick, I saw a piece of bark peeled from a tree. It was stripped clean in one long curl, and beneath it, someone had carved something into the trunk. It was a rough X shape, big and shallow. I hadn't seen it before. It looked fresh. I touched the groove and bits of sap came off on my fingers. I hadn't carved it. No way. I hadn't even brought anything to do that. And it wasn't an animal. It was too clean. I stood there for a while, staring at that mark. Then I backed away and returned to the cabin. I shut the door, slid the wooden latch in place, and pulled the small table in front of it. I felt ridiculous doing it, but I also didn't want to go outside again that day. I made dinner from a can, ate quickly, and went to bed early. I kept the lantern on longer than usual. Every creak outside made me freeze. I didn't hear anything major, just soft thuds sometimes, like distant footsteps on damp ground. I told myself over and over it was just animals, probably raccoons or deer. The forest was full of them. But the next morning, when I stepped outside, I saw something that made my mouth go dry. There were boot prints, not mine. They were different, wider, deeper. They came from the woods and stopped about 5 feet from the front of the cabin. They didn't go to the door. They didn't circle the place. They just stopped there, facing it. Whoever made them stood there for a long time. The ground was pressed in more at the front of each print, like someone had been leaning forward slightly, watching. I bent down and examined them closely. They were still damp, edges clean. They couldn't have been more than a few hours old. My stomach twisted. I hadn't heard anything in the night. Not that loud anyway. No knocking. No footsteps close to the walls. But someone had come. Someone had stood there, and then left. But there were no footprints leading back. That part stuck with me, hard. There were clear steps approaching from the trees, but not a single print leading away. I walked around the cabin twice, looking in every direction, and found nothing else. It was like the person just vanished. I stayed inside that whole day. I sat by the window, staring out with my knife in my hand. I told myself to calm down, that maybe I was being paranoid, that maybe the prints had been there before and I just didn't notice. But the part of me that believed that was shrinking fast. I considered leaving, but the trail was long and rough, and if someone was out there, I didn't want to meet them halfway through the woods with no one to help me. That night, I hardly slept. I kept the knife by my side and the lantern on the floor. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those prints again. On the 8th day, I decided to leave early. I packed everything fast, didn't even eat breakfast. I had just enough water to hike back to the car. The whole walk felt wrong. The forest felt thicker, darker. I kept stopping to listen. At one point, I swore I saw someone standing far off between the trees, but when I blinked, they were gone. I didn't stop to check. I just kept walking, faster. I got to the car, turned it on, and locked the doors before I even put on my seatbelt. I didn't look back at the woods as I drove away. When I got home, I turned my phone back on. There were messages, sure, work stuff, missed calls, but that wasn't what hit me. What hit me was an email from the listing site I used. It was dated 4 days ago, about the time things started getting weird. The message said the listing had been taken down. Asterisk cabin number 119 has been removed due to ongoing legal issues involving trespassing, safety complaints, and unauthorized access to the property. We advise anyone currently staying at the location to vacate immediately and contact the authorities if anything unusual occurs. Asterisk. I read it 3 times. My hands were shaking. I didn't contact the police. What would I? I don't think I'll ever go into the woods again. Not like that. Not alone. I always thought I was the type of person who could handle things. Someone who could take care of himself no matter where he was. I believed that if something bad ever happened out in the middle of nowhere, I'd be able to stay calm and think my way through it. I thought I was the kind of man who didn't panic easily. I was wrong. It started off simple. A friend of mine named Curtis worked for a land development company, and they were looking at buying up a huge stretch of land deep in the mountains. Old mining territory, mostly unused for decades. The company wanted someone to do a basic site evaluation, just get an idea of the access roads, the general terrain, and any existing structures that might be worth something. They didn't need anything technical, just a simple assessment before they sent in surveyors and engineers. Curtis knew I'd been between jobs, and he thought I could handle a trip like that. I had hiking experience, basic backwoods survival skills, and most importantly, I had the time. He said there was a cabin up there that I could stay in. It used to belong to the foreman of one of the mines. Still had a wood stove, furniture, and even a small generator. He told me it'd be peaceful. He even said the view was incredible. Wide open forest, no neighbors for miles, and clear stars at night. I agreed. The pay wasn't amazing, but it was decent enough for a week's work. All I had to do was stay in the cabin, check out the roads and trails, take pictures of anything worth noting, and file a report when I got back. Sounded easy, sounded relaxing even. I packed my gear carefully: hiking boots, thermal layers, water filtration tablets, plenty of food, my camping stove, a medical kit, my hunting knife, a strong flashlight, extra batteries, and my GPS. I even brought a portable solar charger, just in case the generator wasn't working. I printed out satellite maps and topographic overlays. I didn't plan on going unprepared. The cabin was about a 6-hour drive from the nearest town. The last 2 hours were on a dirt trail that curved higher and higher into the hills. I drove slowly. The trail had deep ruts from old truck tires and broken branches everywhere. There were no signs, just dense forest and the sound of my tires crunching gravel and dead leaves. When I arrived, the cabin looked even more isolated than I expected. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by thick pine trees. It had a tin roof, a wooden porch, and faded green paint on the shutters. One of the steps creaked when I walked up it. The air was still. The forest seemed to press in close, as if the trees were leaning inward. No wind, no birds, just the sound of my boots and the occasional rustle of something moving far off in the underbrush. I unlocked the door with the key Curtis gave me. Inside, it smelled like dry wood and old paper. Dust floated in the light that came through the window. There was a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area with a propane stove, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed against the far wall. Everything looked clean enough, though unused. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air and began to unpack. The first couple of days went fine. I made short hikes during the day, exploring the trails around the cabin and taking pictures. I found the collapsed entrance to an old mine shaft and a rusted-out truck half buried in the dirt. I marked down anything that looked important and made sure to log my GPS coordinates for each site. At night, I cooked simple meals, wrote notes in my notebook, and read an old novel I'd brought along. The generator worked, though I used it sparingly to save fuel. I spent a lot of time just listening to the quiet. It was a kind of silence you don't get anywhere else, not even in small towns. This was full, deep silence. No cars, no distant hum of electricity, no human sounds at all, just the creaks of the cabin settling, the wind moving through the trees, and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere far off. On the third night, I started hearing something strange. It was around 2 a.m. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard a series of slow, heavy thumps outside. At first I thought it was a branch falling, but then it happened again. Not like footsteps exactly, more like something big shifting its weight. Then silence. I stayed still in bed, listening. My heart started beating faster. I stared at the ceiling and held my breath. Then I heard it again. A thump, then the faint creak of one of the porch steps. I sat up slowly and reached for my flashlight. I didn't want to use it right away. I didn't want to shine it out the window and let someone or something know exactly where I was. I stayed in the dark, listening. The noise didn't come again. After a long time, I finally got up and crept to the front window. I peeked through the curtain, expecting to see an animal or a person, but there was nothing. Just the porch, the clearing, and the tree line. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe an elk, something big enough to make heavy steps. That made sense. The area was full of wildlife. Still, I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I checked around the porch. The ground was dry and firm, and I didn't see any tracks. I even walked down to the trail to look for signs of movement, but there was nothing. No broken branches, no footprints, no claw marks. It was like nothing had been there. That afternoon, I hiked further than usual. I found another mine entrance, this one still open. The boards around it were rotted and black. A metal warning sign lay half buried in the dirt. I stood near the edge and looked inside. It sloped down into pure blackness. The air coming out of it was cold, colder than the outside air. I felt uneasy standing there, like something was off, but I couldn't say what. I took a few pictures and backed away. That night, I stayed inside with the door locked and a chair braced under the handle. I cooked and read like usual, but I kept checking the windows every few minutes. Nothing happened. No sounds. No movement. But the next morning, something was different. When I stepped outside, I noticed the front porch looked off. I walked around it and found deep scratches along the bottom edge of one of the support beams. They weren't from a branch or a tool. They looked like claw marks, long, deep grooves, maybe 5 of them in a row. The wood was splintered. I ran my fingers over them. Fresh. I felt a wave of cold pass through me. I looked around at the trees. The sun was out. The forest was quiet, but I felt watched. I tried to shake it off and told myself it was a bear. Maybe it had come during the night. Still, I went back inside, locked the door, and kept my knife close for the rest of the day. That evening, the generator stopped working. I had fuel, but when I tried restarting it, it made a grinding sound and sputtered out. I opened the side panel and checked the parts, but I didn't know enough about engines to fix it. I tried again and again, but it just wouldn't turn over. I gave up and lit a few candles. Later that night, just before bed, I heard it again. This time it was louder. Slow, steady thumps, like something circling the cabin. I could hear the boards on the porch creaking under its weight. My heart pounded in my chest. I stood there in the dark, gripping my flashlight. I didn't want to turn it on, but I needed to see. I flicked it on and aimed it at the window. Something moved just out of sight. I caught the briefest flicker of movement, something dark and low to the ground. It moved fast, slipping behind the far corner of the cabin. I ran to the other window and looked out, but there was nothing there, just the empty clearing and the dark trees beyond it. I didn't sleep at all that night. At dawn, I packed my bag. I had enough information for the report. I decided I'd hike down to the truck and drive back to town. I didn't want to spend another night up there. I loaded everything into my pack and stepped outside. That's when I saw it. Behind the cabin, not far from the edge of the tree line, was a large hole in the ground. I hadn't noticed it before. The dirt around it looked freshly disturbed, like it had been dug recently. I walked over to it slowly. The hole was deep, too deep for an animal. The edges were sharp, the bottom flat. Something had been buried there, or maybe something had been dug up. Next to the hole was something worse, a torn piece of cloth, dirty, stained. It looked like part of a jacket. Not mine, someone else's. I knelt down and saw something sticking out from the soil near the edge. I reached down and pulled it out. It was a rusted metal tag. On the back, barely legible through the corrosion, was a number and a name, J.C. Westman. It looked like an old mining ID badge. I stared at it for a long time. Then I looked at the hole again. That's when I realized this wasn't an animal. Something or someone had been digging up this land. Maybe recently, maybe even while I was sleeping. The mine entrances, the claw marks, the movement in the night, it all started to make a different kind of sense. This wasn't just an abandoned cabin in the woods. Something had happened here, something that someone didn't want found. I turned and walked straight to the trail. I didn't run, but I walked fast. I'm not sure what made me choose that particular weekend to go up to the cabin. Maybe it was how heavy everything felt lately. Work had become a grind. People were getting on my nerves more easily, and I just couldn't get proper sleep. My uncle had this old place up in northern Idaho, tucked far into the woods. He hadn't used it in years, but he kept the key in a drawer and said I could go anytime. So I packed my stuff, filled the gas tank, and left before sunrise on a Friday morning. It was a 5-hour drive from my place. I didn't bring much, just a duffel bag with clothes, a couple of frozen meals, a pan, some instant coffee, a water filter, a few canned things, and my hunting knife. I didn't plan on doing anything exciting. I just wanted to be away from the world for a while. The deeper I drove into the forest roads, the better I felt. My phone lost signal somewhere past the second fork in the dirt road, and it was actually a relief. The last stretch of the road was rough and narrow. The tires on my old truck crunched slowly over gravel and pine needles. The branches leaned in above me, making it darker than it should have been for that time of day. The cabin finally appeared in the trees like a shadow, and I parked off to the side, right where the grass started swallowing the edge of the driveway. I could see that no one had been up there in a while. A few shingles were missing, one of the window shutters was broken off and hanging, and the whole thing looked like it had settled even lower into the earth than I remembered. Still, it felt like what I needed. I unlocked the door, pushed it open, and let the stale, musty air hit me. It smelled like damp wood and dust, but it wasn't horrible. I opened a couple of windows to air it out, shook the sheets off the mattress, and set up my stuff in the one bedroom. It was a small place, just a kitchen with a wood stove, a living room with a dusty recliner and an old coffee table, and the bedroom in the back. No running water, but there was an outhouse out behind the trees. There was a stream about half a mile down, and I had a gravity filter anyway. I settled in easily. That first night, I sat on the steps out front and drank instant coffee while listening to the wind move through the trees. I didn't think about work, bills, people, or anything. It was peaceful. I stayed up late reading a paperback I brought. The only light I had came from an old lantern and a flashlight, but it worked. I went to bed feeling okay. For once, my mind was quiet, but the second day things started to feel off. I woke up early, maybe around 6. The sun was just starting to rise. I stepped outside to stretch and walked down toward the stream. The air was cold and clear. No sounds except for birds and the crunch of my boots. I filled my bottles, walked back, and made a small fire in the fire ring to cook a can of beans for breakfast. That's when I noticed it. Something small but strange. Right near the edge of the trees, maybe 10 feet from where I had parked, there were 2 sets of boot prints in the dirt. Fresh ones. Not from me. I had worn hiking shoes, and these were larger, deeper. The kind of boots with heavy treads. One set came in from the trees. The other set went back out. At first, I thought maybe they were mine from last night and I just didn't remember walking over there. But the more I looked, the more it didn't add up. The tracks were clearer and fresher than any I could have made. I had barely left the porch the night before. I felt a small knot form in my stomach. I brushed it off. Maybe a hunter had wandered close during the night and left. There were no signs of anything else missing or disturbed, but I did start locking the cabin door when I stepped outside from then on. That evening, I decided to walk a little farther out. I followed a faded trail I remembered from years ago. It looped around the back of the hill and overlooked a valley on the other side. I brought my knife just in case, even though I hadn't seen or heard anything bigger than a squirrel since arriving. The hike was good, cleared my head, but when I got back, the feeling that something was off got worse. The front door was slightly open. I froze. I had locked it. I knew I had. I always double-checked before leaving. I walked slowly up to the porch and waited, listening. No sounds inside. No movement. I stepped in carefully and scanned the cabin. Nothing was missing. Nothing was moved. My bag was right where I left it. The bed was untouched. The lantern was still on the table. But the window in the back bedroom was open, and I hadn't opened it. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept the lantern burning. I stayed in bed with the knife in my hand and my ears open. Every little sound outside made me jump. The wind in the trees, the creaking of the wood beams, even the occasional snap of a branch far off. I stayed like that for hours. Eventually, I must have dozed off. When I woke, it was morning, and nothing looked different. But I couldn't relax anymore. I thought about leaving, packing up and heading home, but it felt cowardly. Maybe it had just been some animal, maybe a raccoon or something. The window was old and didn't latch well, so I stayed. But I kept my knife closer, and I started checking every inch of the cabin every couple of hours. On the third day, something happened that I can't explain easily. I was walking the trail again, trying to feel normal. I stayed out longer this time, figuring I'd tire myself out and sleep better that night. When I returned, I saw something new. There were fresh marks on one of the trees near the cabin. Scratches about shoulder height. For deep lines, not random, too clean for an animal. Like someone had dragged a blade across the bark, deliberately. I checked around and found more on another tree about 15 feet away. Same height, same pattern. I stood there for a while, just staring. The forest was quiet. Way too quiet. No birds. No rustling. I backed away slowly and went into the cabin. I pushed the dresser against the front door. That night, I didn't sleep at all. At around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps on the porch. Not heavy, Just a few steps, then nothing. I sat on the bed holding the knife. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited. I thought about calling for help, but my phone had no signal, and the cabin had no landline. The footsteps didn't come again. No knock, no sound. At sunrise, I opened the door slowly and looked outside. Nothing. No prints this time. The ground was hard, but there was something left on the porch. A single cigarette butt. It wasn't there the day before. I don't smoke. I almost left right then and there. I loaded the truck with my bag, started the engine, and sat in the driver's seat. But something held me back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I didn't want to admit that I was scared. I cut the engine and brought my bag back inside. I shouldn't have. That afternoon, I went to the stream again to fill up water. When I came back, I found the back window wide open. This time, the curtain was torn, and there were muddy boot prints on the floor leading toward the door. Someone had come in again. I stepped back outside and circled the cabin. Nothing. No movement in the trees. No sounds. But something had changed in me. I stopped thinking about peace and started thinking about survival. I took a long branch, sharpened one end, and kept it near the bed. I cleaned the knife and kept it under my pillow. I moved the dresser back in front of the door and jammed a metal spoon under the doorknob to keep it from turning. That night, I didn't lie down. I sat in the chair facing the door, waiting. At around midnight, I heard the window creak. Not the front door, the side window. I didn't move. I just listened. Then came the sound of someone trying to push it open. I stood up slowly and crept toward it. The curtain was drawn, but I could see the corner lift slightly like someone was poking at it from outside. I grabbed the branch and yanked the curtain back. Nothing there, but in the dirt outside, I saw the outline of a person's knee print, deep in the mud. Someone had been crouching just outside the window. That was the moment I made my decision. I was going to leave. The first light, I packed everything quickly, threw my things in the truck and didn't bother cleaning up. I didn't care. I just wanted out. I drove fast down the gravel road, the truck bouncing and rattling. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again. I didn't sleep properly for weeks after that. Even back in my apartment, I kept checking my windows. I changed the locks. I bought cameras. A few days after I got home, I checked my phone. Somehow, one photo had been taken that I didn't remember capturing. It was blurry, taken inside the cabin, facing the bedroom. I wasn't in it, but someone else was. A man, partly in frame, standing near the door. I deleted the photo. I never went back to that cabin. I told my uncle it wasn't safe and he should tear it down. He never did. I wasn't really looking for trouble when I booked that cabin. I just wanted to get away from everything. Work had been rough for months. Long hours, endless meetings, late-night emails. I was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. Burnt out and annoyed by the smallest things. I wanted quiet, that's all. Just peace and quiet. I found this listing online for a cabin deep in the woods, about 4 hours from the city. It was advertised as secluded, peaceful, and off-grid. That's what I wanted. I didn't want to see people or hear traffic or smell exhaust fumes. I didn't want to think about my phone or my inbox. I wanted silence. I wanted to sit still. I wanted to hear wind moving through trees. The pictures showed a small wooden cabin, nothing fancy. Just one floor, a porch, a couple chairs outside, and forest in every direction. The listing said it had solar power, a well for water, and a wood stove for heat. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi. I liked that. I even liked the idea of being unreachable. So I booked it for 2 weeks. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Not exactly. I said I was going to a cabin in the woods to rest. I didn't bother with more details. I just wanted to disappear for a bit. I left on a Tuesday morning, packed everything I thought I'd need. Cans of food, dry goods, batteries, flashlights, books, a small axe, and a hunting knife I'd had for years. I wasn't going to hunt. I didn't even have a gun. I just brought the knife in case I needed to cut wood or rope or something. It felt smart to have one. The drive was long and the last hour was nothing but dirt roads. Trees got taller, thicker. No signs, no lights, no people. Just a narrow track winding through endless forest. I had to stop a few times to check the GPS I downloaded in advance. My tires kicked up dust and branches scraped the sides of my car. For a moment, I wondered if I was making a mistake. When I finally reached the cabin, the first thing I noticed was the silence. I stepped out of the car and didn't hear anything. No cars, no voices, no planes above. Just wind through leaves and the faint sound of birds. The air was cooler, cleaner. It smelled like pine and earth. The cabin looked just like the pictures. Weathered wood, a small porch, one door, two windows. There was a shed behind it and a small metal drum for fires. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It was one open room with a bed in the corner, a small table, shelves on the walls, and the wood stove against the far wall. There was a lantern hanging from a hook. A few small windows let in sunlight. It was simple but clean. I spent the first few hours unpacking, stacking firewood, checking the solar lights and water system. Everything worked fine. That night, I lit a small fire in the drum outside and sat in one of the chairs. The sky was full of stars, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen that many. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're hearing things, like your brain invents noise just to fill the space. That first night, I slept like a rock. I woke up late the next morning, made coffee on the propane stove, and sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket. The sun filtered through the trees. I didn't hear a single car or voice all day, just birds, wind, and the creak of trees. Days passed like that. I read books, made food, chopped a bit of wood, walked through the forest trails. I didn't hike far, just enough to stretch my legs and get used to the area. The cabin sat in a small clearing with trees packed tight all around. There was no cell signal at all, no GPS. After a short distance, even my downloaded maps stopped helping. Still, it felt safe. There were no signs of other people. No trash, no campsites, no boot prints. Just trees and more trees. I liked it that way. At night, I stayed close to the cabin. Once the sun went down, the forest got dark fast. And I mean pitch black. No streetlights, no moon half the time. Just blackness and the sounds of the woods. By the end of the first week, I felt calmer than I had in years. I didn't miss my phone. I didn't miss people. I barely remembered the city. I just followed the same rhythm every day. Wake up, eat, walk, read, eat again, sit by the fire, go to sleep. Over and over. And I loved it. But on the 9th night, something changed. It was around 2 or 3 in the morning. I woke up suddenly, not because of a dream, but because I thought I heard something. At first I thought it was wind, but then I heard it again. A sharp crack, like a stick snapping. I lay there in the dark, listening. The cabin was quiet. No footsteps, no voices, just that one sound. A crack, then silence. I told myself it was a branch falling or maybe an animal. Deer maybe, could have even been a raccoon. I rolled over and tried to fall back asleep. Then I heard it again. Another crack, closer. I sat up slowly, straining my ears. My heart was beating harder than it should have. I wasn't scared yet, just alert. I reached over and turned on the solar lantern. The soft light filled the room. I slipped on my jacket and slowly walked to the window. Couldn't see much, just trees and darkness. I stood there for a few minutes, staring, but nothing moved. No more sounds, just silence again. I went back to bed and kept the lantern on. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I walked around the clearing, looking for tracks. The dirt was dry and covered with pine needles. I didn't see anything strange. No boot prints, no animal tracks. Nothing broken, nothing out of place. Still, something about that noise stuck with me. It didn't sound like a falling branch. It sounded like weight, like pressure on a stick until it snapped. That afternoon, I chopped more firewood and sharpened the blade of the axe. I tried not to think too much. It was probably an animal. I knew that, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched. That night, I locked the cabin door and secured the shutters. I left the lantern off to save power but kept the flashlight close. I listened to the woods. The wind was soft, steady, no strange sounds, until around 3 a.m. I was half asleep when I heard something thump against the wall. Not a branch, not wind. It was solid. It hit the back of the cabin, low, near the floor. Then another thump, slightly harder. Then silence again. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I didn't move for maybe 10 minutes, just stared at the door, listening. Then I quietly got up and walked to the window. I used the flashlight to scan the trees, the clearing, the fire drum, the shed. Nothing. The next morning I checked again. Still no tracks, no marks on the wall, just more silence. The rest of that day I didn't walk far. I stayed close, kept the axe nearby, listened hard. I kept trying to explain it away. Maybe an animal bumped the wall. Maybe a branch fell just right. Maybe it was in my head. But the sounds were real. I knew they were. That night I didn't sleep. I just sat on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, axe next to me, flashlight in my hand. The cabin felt smaller than ever. The windows looked like holes. I didn't like how the trees pressed in from all sides. I kept thinking about how alone I was. And again, around 3 a.m., I heard movement. But this time it was softer, more like footsteps on leaves. Slow, careful. They moved from behind the cabin to the side window. I stayed still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped. Then something scratched the window. Not loud, just the faint sound of something thin dragging across glass. Once, then again. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't move. I waited. Eventually, it stopped. The footsteps faded back into the woods. I didn't sleep at all. When morning came, I checked the window. Nothing there. No marks. I circled the cabin again. Still nothing. But I knew what I'd heard. That day, I packed my things. I wasn't staying the full 2 weeks. I'd had enough. I loaded the car and locked the cabin. I was done. But the car wouldn't start. Battery was dead. I sat there in the driver's seat, turning the key over and over. Nothing. Just a clicking sound. I popped the hood. I'm no mechanic, but the battery cables looked fine. Everything looked normal. I checked my phone. Still no signal. I tried walking a short distance down the road, thinking maybe I could get a bar or two. Nothing. Just miles of forest in every direction. I could have tried walking back to the main road, but that was hours away. And something told me it wasn't safe to leave the cabin now. I spent the next night inside, lights off, axe in hand. I barely moved. I kept thinking I heard something. Branches snapping, footsteps, breathing. The next morning I found boot prints. Not mine. Bigger, deeper. They came from the forest and stopped just outside the front porch, then turned around and went back. I didn't walk that way. I didn't own boots like that. That's when I knew someone was out there. Not an animal, not a dream, person. It started because I wanted peace. I had been working straight through the last 8 months. Long hours, 6 days a week, sometimes 7. I was drained mentally, physically. I wasn't even thinking straight. I kept telling myself I needed to unplug, breathe fresh air, and get away from city noise and glowing screens. So when a friend of mine mentioned his uncle had an old cabin out near a lake up north, tucked deep in the woods and completely isolated, I didn't think twice. I said yes before I even knew how far it was or what condition it was in. I didn't even ask. I just said yes. The drive up was long. 6 hours behind the wheel with just the sound of tires humming and trees passing by. I had stocked the back of my truck with supplies, a couple weeks worth of food, a cooler packed with ice, bottled water, canned stuff, a big container of dry goods, camping stove, a solar battery, even a few books. I packed like I was going off the grid, which is exactly what I wanted. No cell signal, no internet, no noise, just me and the woods. When I finally arrived, it was late afternoon. The sky was clear, but the sun was already falling low, casting long orange shadows across the clearing. The cabin sat a few dozen feet back from the edge of a small lake, surrounded by thick forest on all sides. There was no driveway, just a gravel path that cut through the trees and ended in a patch of flattened grass where I parked. I shut off the engine and listened. It was quiet. No hum of traffic, no planes, no voices. Just birds, wind through the leaves, and the creaking of trees. I stood there a minute, letting my ears adjust. It was peaceful, like a weight coming off my shoulders. I didn't even care that the place looked a little run down. The porch sagged slightly, a shutter hung crooked on one window, and the roof had patches that looked like they'd been repaired with different colored shingles. Still, it was a roof. It was shelter, and it was mine for the next 2 weeks. I unlocked the front door with a key left under a rusted tin can beside the step. Inside, the air was stale and smelled like dust and old wood. The furniture was sparse. One old sofa with a blanket thrown over it, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a fireplace lined with soot. There was a bedroom in the back with a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a window that faced the lake. The kitchen had no fridge, just shelves, an old propane stove, and a rusty sink that connected to a hand pump well. There was a bathroom, but the toilet was an outhouse 20 feet behind the cabin. That was fine. I expected all that. I wasn't looking for comfort. I brought my gear inside, unpacked the cooler, set up the little solar charger near the window, and opened a few windows to let fresh air in. Then I sat on the porch, drank a bottle of water, and watched the sun sink behind the trees. Felt like I had all the time in the world. That night, I slept better than I had in months.
No alarms, no buzzes, no emails, no noise.
Just the sound of wind and the occasional hoot of an owl. The bed was stiff and creaked when I moved, but I didn't care. My body relaxed, like it was finally allowed to rest. The first few days went by slow, and that was what I wanted. I spent my time reading, fishing in the lake, hiking a little, and chopping wood. I made coffee on the propane burner in the morning and drank it sitting on the porch. At night, I lit candles and read by lantern. I kept a small logbook, writing down things like how many fish I caught, how the weather was, what kind of birds I saw. I even wrote about a fox I spotted near the tree line on the 3rd morning. But then, little by little, something started to feel off. It was small things at first. I thought I was imagining it. One morning, I woke up to find my fishing rod moved. I had left it propped against the railing on the porch after dinner, but when I came out the next day, it was laying flat on the grass, about 10 feet away. I told myself it must have fallen and rolled off, but the reel was scuffed like it had been dragged. A few nights later, I heard something outside around 2 in the morning. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a raccoon maybe, but it wasn't the same sound. It was slower, heavier. Something walking. I lay there in bed, eyes open in the dark, trying to hold my breath to hear better. The footsteps crunched through the leaves, then stopped. A few seconds passed, and I heard them again, closer this time. They moved around the side of the cabin, then stopped again. I waited. Nothing. Silence. I got up and looked through the window but saw nothing. Just trees and moonlight. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe even a bear. I went back to bed, but my sleep wasn't as deep after that. Every creak of the cabin made me listen. The next day, I walked around the cabin, looking for tracks or signs. I found something behind the outhouse. It was a footprint. At least it looked like one. But it wasn't a boot and it wasn't a paw. It was a bare foot, human, deep enough to be fresh. Not mine. I hadn't been out barefoot. And it was larger than mine, longer. I stood there staring at it for a long time. The dirt around the outhouse was soft, and it had rained lightly the night before. The print was fresh. I crouched down and looked closer. You could see the heel, the arch, even the toes. I told myself maybe someone was camping nearby. Maybe a hiker got lost. Maybe a hunter. But this place wasn't close to any trail. The gravel road was 10 miles from the nearest highway, and even that wasn't heavily used. Still, I told myself it had to be nothing. I didn't want to panic. That night, I locked the door and wedged a chair under the knob. Even though it was solid wood and had a metal bolt, I kept my hatchet next to the bed. The next 2 nights were quiet. I started to think maybe I overreacted. Maybe it was my own print from earlier that got stretched by rain. Maybe an animal stepped in a weird way. I didn't know, but I stopped sleeping as well. I stayed up late, listening. Then, one afternoon, I went down to the lake to refill a bucket of water. I walked about 20 steps from the cabin, just enough for a clear path to the shore. The sun was hot, and everything looked normal. But when I got back to the porch, the door was open. I knew I had closed it. I knew it. I had locked it. The bolt was still turned to locked, but the door was wide open. The chair I had wedged under the knob the night before was pushed over, laying on its side. I walked inside slowly, heart pounding in my ears. I kept the hatchet in my hand. Nothing looked stolen. Nothing looked moved. But I checked everything, the bedroom, under the bed, the kitchen, even the closet. Nobody was there. No one I could see anyway. I checked all the windows. Locked. Then I saw something on the floor by the fireplace. A smear of dirt, like a bare foot had stepped on the wood, left a mark and then backed away. It was angled weird, like someone had been standing just inside, facing the door. That's when the fear settled in. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't me being paranoid. Someone had been in the cabin. Someone had been watching, waiting for me to leave. I packed that night. I wasn't going to stay another day. I had planned to stay 2 weeks. I left after 6 days. But when I went to start the truck the next morning, the battery was dead. I popped the hood. The cables were gone. Not loose. Gone. Both had been cut and pulled out. I stood there in the quiet, staring at the empty space where they should have been. My skin crawled. I was stuck. No cell service. No landline. No neighbors. 10 miles to the main road. I had no idea if anyone even passed that road on a regular basis. I had told a couple people I'd be gone 2 weeks, and I had no way of telling them I was leaving early. That night was the worst. I stayed awake in the bedroom with the lantern lit and the hatchet on my lap. I didn't sleep at all. Every sound outside made my chest tighten. I kept the curtains closed and sat on the floor beside the bed, back against the wall, heart pounding. Just after midnight, I heard footsteps again, slower this time, not circling, just walking up. They stopped outside the front door. Then I heard the porch creak under weight. It stayed like that for nearly an hour. No knock, no sound, just silence. Then finally the creaking faded. The footsteps backed away. I didn't open the curtain. I didn't look. I just waited for morning. As soon as the sun came up, I took what I could carry and left. I didn't even lock the cabin. I ran down the gravel road, heading toward the highway. I walked for hours. My legs ached, my throat was dry, and I didn't stop until I saw a car pass in the distance. I waved it down like a maniac. The guy who picked me up drove me to the nearest town. I called my friend, told him what happened. He thought I was joking. Then he told me something I'll never forget. He said his uncle had stopped using that cabin years ago because someone had been breaking in. Small things at first, then bigger stuff. One time he found a dead rabbit nailed to the wall inside. Another time he found someone's dirty clothes under the bed. The last time he went, he said he saw a man standing across. I drove up to the cabin around mid-morning. The clouds were thick, hanging low, casting a flat gray over everything. The road leading to the cabin was mostly gravel, and I could feel every bump and dip in the steering wheel. I'd rented the place online for a week. I needed a break from the city, away from phones, away from work, away from people. The listing had said it was private, deep in the woods, with no neighbors for miles. That's exactly what I wanted. The cabin itself was old but solid. Dark wood siding, green metal roof, single story with a wraparound porch. It was nestled at the base of a ridge, surrounded by thick trees on 3 sides, with a clearing out front where I parked my car. There was a small creek running about 40 yards downhill, and I could hear it faintly when I got out of the car. It smelled like pine and wet leaves. Everything felt still, like the air was holding its breath. Inside, it was simple. One main room with a couch, a wood stove, a table, a small kitchen. Off to the side was the bedroom with a queen bed, and a bathroom with a rust-stained tub and a noisy toilet. It had electricity, but no Wi-Fi. Cell service was dead out there, which I knew in advance. I had brought enough groceries for the whole week, a few books, and my hunting gear. I didn't plan on doing much hunting, but I liked having the rifle with me. It made me feel a little safer in places like that. I unpacked slowly, I took my time. I wanted to enjoy the silence. I put the food away, laid out my clothes in the small dresser, and checked the windows to make sure they all locked properly. I always did that, even in remote places. I don't know why. Habit, maybe. I stacked some firewood by the stove just in case the power went out, which seemed possible. There was a backup generator outside, too, half buried in weeds. By the time I finished, it was early afternoon. I sat on the porch with a cup of instant coffee and just listened. Birds, mostly. Wind in the trees. The creek. I didn't see any other cabins or roads or signs of people, which reassured me. That's when I saw him. He was standing at the tree line on the far side of the clearing, where the forest started again after the grass ended. Maybe 70 or 80 feet away. He was just there. Not walking, not moving. Just standing. He wasn't facing me. His shoulders were angled away slightly, and his head was down like he was looking at something on the ground. He wore dark clothes, a jacket, jeans, boots. He didn't look like a hiker or a camper. He looked like someone who belonged in a place like that. But he didn't move. That's what struck me the most. He just stood completely still. I waited, watching. I thought maybe he was hunting or tracking something, though I didn't see a rifle or any gear. After maybe a full minute, I stood up slowly, trying not to make much noise. I didn't want to spook him, but the moment I did, he turned and walked straight back into the trees. He didn't run. He didn't look up. He just walked away, not even fast, just steady and calm, like he knew exactly where he was going. I stood there for a while longer. My heart was beating faster than I expected. I tried to shake it off. It's public forest land, I reminded myself. He could have been a hunter or just some local. Maybe he didn't know I was there until he saw me. Maybe he was embarrassed. I tried to believe that. Still, something about how still he stood, how quiet it had been, how fast he disappeared, it got under my skin. I went back inside, locked the door, and checked the windows again. Nothing was broken. Nothing looked touched. That night, I couldn't sleep well. I kept waking up. The woods outside were loud, even without animals. The trees creaked. The wind shifted often. Every small noise felt like it meant something. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard something on the porch. Just one soft creak. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, holding still. I didn't get up. I just listened. Nothing followed. No footsteps. No knock. I didn't check. I waited until morning. When the sun came up, I went out and looked. Nothing. No footprints. No scratches. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe the wood was just old. But the feeling stayed with me. I spent the next day inside for the most part. I made food. I read. I cleaned a bit even though it was already clean. I kept checking the clearing through the windows, but he never came back. I told myself I was being paranoid. I had come out there to be alone, and now I was scared of being alone. I almost laughed at myself. On the third day, I went for a walk. There was a rough trail behind the cabin that went up toward the ridge. I figured I needed to get out and stop being afraid of trees and wind. I took my rifle with me just to feel safer. The trail was overgrown in parts, but you could still follow it. I climbed slowly, stopping to rest every now and then. At the top of the ridge, I found a small flat spot where someone had once made a fire ring. Rocks were still arranged in a circle, blackened in the middle. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. From there, I could see down into the woods on the other side. I scanned for movement, half hoping I'd see a deer or something, but I didn't see animals. I saw something else. Down in the trees, maybe 100 yards away, I saw what looked like a tarp stretched between two trunks. It was dark green, hard to spot at first. There was something underneath it, boxes maybe, or bags. Couldn't tell. It looked like someone had set up a camp there, but it was too far to see clearly. I stared at it for a long time. My first thought was maybe it was his camp, the man from the clearing. If that was the case, it meant he was living out here, not just passing through. That didn't sit right with me. I hiked back down. Took longer because I kept looking over my shoulder. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest didn't feel empty anymore. That night, I stayed up later than usual. I kept the lights off and just watched out the window, listening. Around midnight, I saw movement. Not close, but out past the clearing again. Just inside the tree line. It was too dark to see clearly, but I could tell someone was walking. Not toward the cabin, just slowly pacing back and forth near the edge of the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the dark with the rifle across my lap, waiting for morning. On the 5th day, I decided to leave early. I didn't care if I wasted money on the last 2 nights. It wasn't worth staying if I couldn't relax. I started packing in the morning, but when I stepped outside to load the car, I stopped. There were boot prints in the dirt. Not mine. They were fresh, still sharp around the edges. They came from the woods, circled the cabin once, and then went back. I hadn't heard anything the night before. Nothing at all. But someone had been right there, walking around the cabin in the dark. That broke something in me. I threw my things in the car, grabbed the last of the food, and locked the cabin behind me. I didn't care if I left anything behind. I just wanted to go. The gravel road back to the highway was rough, and I drove faster than I should have. The trees pressed in on both sides, and every shadow felt like it was about to step into the road. I didn't breathe easy until I saw pavement again. But here's the thing. 2 days later, back in the city, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept wondering who he was, what he wanted, why he didn't do anything but watch. That's what kept bothering me, the watching. Out of some twisted curiosity, I looked up that area online. I didn't expect to find much, but I came across a forum thread from a few years back. Someone had posted about a man living in the woods near that same ridge, near that same creek. A hermit, they called him. No one knew his name. People said he didn't talk, didn't beg, didn't hurt anyone, just watched. But there were other posts too. Hikers missing, cars found abandoned. One guy said his tent had been slashed open in the night while he was sleeping in it. He never saw who did it. Another woman said she saw a man crouched outside her camper window just watching her breathe while she slept. No sound, no words, just staring. I don't know if any of it was true. Internet stories are hard to trust. But I know what I saw. I know how quiet it was. I know how close he came without a sound. And I know I'll never go back there. I think about the prints, about the tarp I saw, about the man standing still as stone in the clearing. I think about how someone can live out there for years, unnoticed, moving silently through the trees, learning the land better than anyone. And I think, if I hadn't noticed him that first day, how long would he have watched me before I knew? Maybe I wasn't meant to see him. Maybe that's why he left. Maybe next time he wouldn't. I needed to get away. My head felt like a cage filled with too many thoughts rattling around, each one bumping into the other until I couldn't tell one feeling from another. Everything was too loud. Traffic, notifications, even my own breathing felt heavy. So I decided to get away from the city. Not just away from people, but far from anything. Somewhere cold, somewhere still. I found the cabin through an old classified listing. It wasn't listed on big travel websites, just a picture on a plain page, no reviews, no real details. Just a few lines. Asterisk remote mountain cabin. Quiet. With stove. Solar lighting. No cell service. $60 per night. For night minimum. Asterisk it seemed perfect. The kind of place no one else would bother going to. The drive up took about 6 hours. The last 2 were the hardest. Winding roads, packed snow, and the mountains rising like huge white walls on both sides. I stopped once to stretch my legs and noticed the silence. No birds, no cars, no people. I hadn't heard silence that real in years. It was what I came for. When I finally got to the cabin, I was surprised how simple it looked. 1 floor, slanted roof half covered in snow. Small chimney with a lazy line of smoke still rising from the last guests. Maybe. The key was in a rusted metal box hanging by the front door, just like the owner had described. No cameras, no code, just trust. That's how far out I was. Inside was basic but clean. A bed with an old wool blanket, a wood stove already stocked with logs, a sink that ran thanks to a small indoor tank, and a little folding table near the window. A single solar lamp hung over the bed, and the bathroom was outside, an outhouse maybe 20 steps into the trees. That first night, I made a small fire in the stove and just sat near it with a cup of tea. I didn't even use my phone, even though there was no service. I just sat. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm. My heart wasn't racing. My breath wasn't shallow. I slept early and deep. The second day was quiet too. I hiked a little, saw some animal tracks, maybe deer, nothing big. I boiled water on the stove and read one of the old paperbacks that had been left on a shelf. At night, I ate canned soup with bread and wrote a little in a notebook I had brought. Again, no sound, no lights outside, just blackness and wind brushing the trees. But something happened around 2:30 a.m. I know the time because I had looked at my watch. I had woken up to a soft knocking sound. Not frantic, not loud, just steady. Knock, knock, knock. At first, I thought maybe something had fallen outside. A tree branch, maybe, tapping in the wind. But I could tell it wasn't that. The knocking was too even. 3 seconds apart, each one nearly the same pressure. It came from the back of the cabin, not the front where I had come in, but from the wall opposite the bed. I sat up and listened. After a minute, it stopped. I waited longer. Nothing. I laid back down. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was a dream blending into waking. That happens sometimes in strange places. The next day, I checked the back of the cabin. There was no path leading to that side. Just snow up to my knees, packed down slightly near the corners of the building. But no footprints. Nothing that looked like anyone had walked around there. Still, I told myself it was probably just ice falling from the roof. Maybe a branch that had bent under the weight of snow and tapped the siding before snapping off. That night, I double-locked the door. Even though the cabin was in the middle of nowhere, it felt safer to hear the click of the latch. I made a small fire again, but I didn't feel as calm. I kept glancing at the back wall. I left the lamp on when I went to sleep. I knew it wouldn't stop anything, but I didn't want to wake up in total darkness again. The knocking came again. This time it was louder. Same rhythm. Knock, knock, knock. But harder now. It sounded like someone using their knuckles right on the wood. Slow and deliberate. I sat up instantly. My skin felt tight, like my body knew something was wrong before my brain did. I stood up and waited. Kept going. 10 knocks, maybe 12. Then it stopped. I waited by the stove, gripping the metal poker with both hands. After 10 minutes, I put on my boots, wrapped my jacket tight, and went out the front door. I circled around the side of the cabin with the flashlight. When I got to the back, I looked at the snow. Perfect. Not untouched in the way drifting snow smooths itself, but clean, no tracks. Nothing leading toward the cabin. No sign of movement. No holes from boots. No marks from paws or claws or anything. Just untouched white. But there had been knocking. I hadn't imagined that. I knew I had heard it. I went back inside, locked the door again, and didn't sleep the rest of the night. The third day, I didn't leave the cabin at all. I kept going over it in my head. Could there be something inside the walls? An animal? A loose board? But how would something inside knock like that and stop right when I woke up? I tried to calm myself, telling myself this was what I wanted. Time alone, no distractions. But now that I had it, I was starting to understand how silence could feel like pressure. How stillness could feel like something watching. The day dragged. At night, I left the fire burning longer. I stayed up reading, trying not to look at the back wall. Around midnight, I thought maybe the knocking wouldn't happen if I was still awake. But then it did. This time, the knocking wasn't on the back wall. It was on the back door. 3 knocks. Not random. Not wind. Not accident. Someone was behind the door, knocking slow and heavy. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't breathe for a long time. Then nothing. I waited 10 minutes. Then 15. Then I turned off the lamp and just sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the poker again, staring at the door. I didn't sleep at all. When daylight came, I opened the back door slowly, ready for anything. There was nothing. No boot prints. No marks. Just snow. Untouched. Like nothing had been there all night. But someone had knocked. Someone was there. The fourth day, I packed my stuff. I didn't care that I had one more night paid for. I didn't care that the drive would be long. I didn't want to be there when night fell again. When I left, I walked around the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. On the far tree, maybe 40 feet from the back of the cabin, there was a rope nailed into the bark, the end frayed like it had broken or been cut. The rope was swinging gently, even though there was no wind, just a soft motion like it had been touched recently. Next to it, in the snow, was a patch where the snow looked packed down, like someone had been standing there for a while. Still no footprints, just that strange compressed shape. I didn't go closer. I didn't want to know more. I drove back without stopping. Every now and then I checked the rearview mirror, thinking I'd see someone sitting in the back seat. I never did. But even after getting home, I couldn't stop thinking about the knocking. Not because I was scared of what was knocking, but because I knew for sure that whoever had been knocking didn't walk to the cabin. They had been waiting there the whole time. I went to the cabin because I needed quiet. My head had been full for weeks, work stuff mostly. I had deadlines and endless meetings, and I'd been sleeping maybe 4 hours a night. The cabin was 2 hours away from the nearest town, up in the hills near the tree line, where the roads were just gravel and turned muddy when it rained. I owned it with my cousin. We'd split the cost years ago. He barely used it. I went every few months when things got too loud in my life. It had no internet, no phone signal, and I liked it that way. It was early November. I knew it was close to snow season, but the forecast said it would stay dry through the weekend. I packed food, water, and a good jacket just in case. My plan was simple. Arrive Friday afternoon, stay until Monday morning, hike a few short trails near the cabin, and get some rest. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I liked it that way too. No one texting me, no one expecting replies. I reached the cabin a bit after 2 p.m. The last stretch of road was rough. Sharp turns, narrow drops, patches of gravel that shook the truck. The sky was cloudy but light, and the wind had picked up. The trees were mostly bare now. Leaves were thick on the ground, covering the trail that led from the cabin to a nearby hilltop I liked to sit on. I unlocked the cabin, opened all the windows for fresh air, and brought in my bags. It was cold inside, musty too, the kind of smell old wood gets when it hasn't been aired out in a while. I turned on the propane heater, then started unpacking. Food went into the small pantry, water jugs by the sink. I didn't bring anything special, just canned beans, rice, peanut butter, oats, some jerky, and coffee. I had matches, a flashlight, a headlamp, a multi-tool, and a first aid kit. I always packed the same way. The first night was fine. I made rice and beans, then sat out on the porch with a blanket and drank coffee from a tin mug. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet you only get far from people. No planes, no traffic, not even animals. Just wind moving through trees, the occasional creak from the porch boards. I stayed out there until my fingers got cold, then went inside, read an old book from the shelf, and went to sleep. The next morning, I woke up with light coming through the window and frost on the glass. It must have dropped below freezing overnight. I made coffee and oats, then layered up and went for a short hike down one of the trails that looped around the north side of the cabin. I carried a day pack, just water, snacks, a knife, and the flashlight. The trail was mostly overgrown with fallen leaves. In some places, it vanished altogether. I followed the old tree markings, faded red paint every few hundred feet. No footprints, no signs of anyone else using it recently. That's what I liked about this place. It always felt like I was the last person on Earth. Took me about 2 hours to loop back. I sat on a boulder near the trail and ate some jerky while watching the valley below. The clouds had thickened since morning. Wind tugged at the bare tree branches. I felt a few snowflakes drift down, light and dry. I knew I'd have to watch the weather closely. Up here, a change in forecast could mean getting stuck. That night, I cooked again, lit a few candles, and kept my jacket on inside. The heater didn't warm things much, and I didn't feel like starting a fire. The wind was louder now, whistling around the corners of the cabin. I tried to read, but I kept checking the windows. The forest looked different at night. like it was hiding something. I shook that thought off and went to bed early. I woke up around 2 a.m. The wind had stopped. Total silence. That kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I sat up, blinking in the dark. I didn't know what woke me. Maybe nothing. Maybe it was just too quiet. I stayed in bed a while, listening. Nothing. I finally fell back asleep. The next morning, I noticed something strange. Footprints, coming from the trees near the trail and circling the cabin. I spotted them in the frost-covered leaves outside the front porch. They weren't deep, but they were fresh. I bent down to look closer. They were boots, not animal tracks. Adult-sized. No snow had fallen overnight, but the ground was frozen. The prints started by the tree line and circled to the back of the cabin. Then they disappeared behind the shed. I walked around, scanning the ground. I didn't see where they led after that. The leaves had been disturbed, but not enough to follow clearly. I stood there a long time trying to make sense of it. No one was supposed to be up here. The nearest property was 5 miles down the gravel road, and no one lived there full-time. I hadn't heard a vehicle. No voices. Nothing. I unlocked the shed and checked inside. Just tools and the old generator. Everything was in place. I walked back to the cabin and locked the door behind me. For the first time since arriving, I felt nervous. I stayed inside most of the day. I kept the headlamp nearby even in daylight, and I moved the axe from the shed to inside the front door. I told myself it was just a hunter, or maybe someone passing through. But it didn't sit right with me. There were no tire tracks, and the way the prints circled the cabin, not toward it, not away, just around, it felt off. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up again. Clouds hung low and thick. I made another quick round outside, checked the doors, peeked into the forest, then came back in. I cooked in silence, ears always open. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking I heard something. Creaks, soft thumps. But the wind could explain that. Wood moves when it's cold. Sunday morning, it snowed. Not heavy, just enough to cover the trail and roof. I thought about leaving early, but I had enough supplies and no reason to rush. I figured I'd wait until morning unless the snow got worse. Midday, I walked the perimeter again. The snow made everything clearer. That's when I saw the new footprints. They were back. Same size, same tread pattern. They came from the same part of the forest, but this time they didn't circle. They stopped right in front of the bedroom window. Just 2 prints side by side, facing the glass. Then nothing. No return tracks, no trail away. Just those 2 prints in the snow, about 6 feet from the wall. They hadn't been there the day before. I felt sick. I went back inside, locked everything again, and pushed a chair under the doorknob. I pulled the blinds closed and sat with my back to the wall, watching the front door. By late afternoon, the snow started to fall again, heavier this time, covered the prints quickly. By sundown, they were gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept the axe beside me and sat near the front window, eyes open, ears straining. I didn't hear anything. Not footsteps, not breathing, not movement, just the soft tap of snow against the roof. When morning finally came, I was packed and ready before the sun rose. I loaded everything into the truck fast, checking over my shoulder the whole time. The snow was a few inches deep, but not frozen solid. I backed out, turned down the trail, and didn't look back. Driving down that gravel road, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. About a mile down, just past a bend where the road narrows, fresh tire tracks. Not mine. The snow was undisturbed when I drove in Friday. These were new, wide tires, deep tread. They came from the opposite direction, uphill, and turned around right at the edge of the woods where the road curves. No sign of the vehicle now. It was gone, but it had been there. I didn't stop to check. I drove straight to the main highway, heart pounding, hands tight on the wheel. When I got home, I checked the local weather reports again. Snow had hit harder than expected. Roads near the cabin were closing. I checked the cabin's trail cams, the ones I had pointed at the deer paths. I usually don't bother pulling the SD cards, but this time I did. I was shaking as I opened the files. One clip stood out. Saturday night, just after 2 a.m. You couldn't see the cabin, just the trees nearby, but someone walked through the edge of the frame, tall, still, wearing a hood. They didn't look at the camera, just stood there for a few seconds. Then they moved out of view. That was it. No face, no sound, just motion in the dark. I stayed away from the cabin after that. For months, my cousin asked if I wanted to sell it. I didn't reply. I never found out who it was. A hunter, a drifter, maybe just some local messing around. But I keep thinking about those footprints, the way they stopped at the window. Not like someone walking past, like someone standing there, watching, listening, waiting. And the worst part, no matter how long I looked, I never saw where they went next. I was never someone who got scared easily. I didn't grow up in the woods or anything, but I had spent enough time hiking, fishing, and camping to be comfortable in the quiet parts of the world. I liked the stillness, the lack of people. I liked not hearing cars or phones, just wind in the trees and maybe a river nearby. That's why I took the trip in the first place. It started when a friend of mine mentioned a hunting cabin his cousin owned. Way out in the woods in central Montana, no electricity, no running water, just a basic wooden structure, an old metal stove, a cot, and a fire pit out back. I didn't know the cousin, but my friend said it was fine if I stayed there for a week or two, as long as I left it clean. I needed a break from work, from emails, from people, so I agreed. I packed everything carefully, 2 big coolers full of food and water, fire starting gear, a rifle for protection, a compass, trail maps, and a notebook. There was no cell signal anywhere near the place, but I had a GPS unit with an SOS feature just in case. I figured that would be enough. I wasn't planning on going far from the cabin anyway. I just wanted to sit still and breathe. The drive took longer than I thought. The final stretch was a dirt road barely wide enough for my truck. Climbed and twisted through pine trees, then dropped into a small valley. That's where the cabin was, about 100 yards from a small ridge. The ridge curved around the back, like a protective wall. On the other sides were nothing but forest and some rocky outcrops. I could barely see the sky by the time I arrived. Late afternoon in mid-October, and the sun was already dipping. The cabin was exactly how my friend described. Simple, square, weathered wood walls and a tin roof. There were a few broken steps leading up to a porch. I walked inside and felt that cold, stale air you only get from places left empty too long. Dust hung in the light slanting through the small window. There was a cot against one wall with a thin mattress. The stove was rusted but solid. A table and a few shelves stood against the opposite wall. It was quiet, really quiet. No birds, no wind, just that weird heavy silence I'd only felt a few times before, usually deep in the woods after snowfall. I spent the first couple of hours settling in. I unpacked, chopped some wood from a nearby pile, and lit a fire in the stove. It was already getting cold. I ate a quick meal from a can, then lay on the cot with my boots off and a blanket over me. It was rough, but I didn't care. I was used to sleeping rough. I camped out plenty of times. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't hear anything at first. I just opened my eyes and felt something strange. It was that kind of sudden wake-up that feels forced. Like your brain knew something was wrong before you could understand what. The cabin was dark. The fire in the stove had burned low. I could barely see the outline of the window. Then I heard it. Crunch. Slow, steady crunching like someone stepping through dry leaves. I didn't move at first. I just lay still, listening. The sound came from outside, near the back of the cabin, near the ridge. It was very slow, one step, then another, maybe 10 seconds apart. Not an animal. Not a deer or raccoon. I've been around animals enough to tell the difference. These were deliberate, heavy steps. Not stomping, just placed. Careful. Then nothing. No footsteps. No wind. No creaks. Just cold air and a strange pressure in my chest. Eventually, I dozed off again. When I woke up the next morning, I went outside and checked around the cabin. I saw the fire pit, the stacked logs, and behind the cabin, just trees. The slope of the ridge climbed sharply. There were leaves all over, sticks and pine needles. I looked for tracks but didn't see anything fresh. Still, I couldn't shake it. It had felt too real to be a dream. But what would someone be doing out here in the middle of nowhere at 2 in the morning? I told myself it was probably a bear, maybe a moose. I stayed armed the whole day anyway. I walked a bit farther up the slope to see if anyone had camped near the ridge, but there was nothing, just rocks and brush. At the top of the ridge, I stood and looked back at the cabin. From up there, you could see straight into the front window. That stuck in my mind. That night, I kept the fire hotter and stayed up later, wrapped in my jacket on the cot, listening. I didn't hear anything for a long time. I started to feel stupid for getting spooked. Then, just before I was about to close my eyes, I heard it again. Crunch. Pause. Another crunch. I sat up slowly and reached for my rifle. The sound was faint but clear, coming from the same direction. Back behind the cabin, near the ridge. I turned off my flashlight and let my eyes adjust. Then I waited. More footsteps, slower this time, closer. I stood up and moved to the window without making a sound. I couldn't see anything, just black trees and the faint moonlight catching on a few leaves. Then it stopped again. I waited at the window for nearly half an hour. Nothing moved. Eventually, I went back to the cot and sat with my back to the wall, rifle across my lap. I stayed that way until sunrise. When the sun came up, I went out again. I circled the cabin slowly, looking for prints. The ground was covered in dry leaves, but near the back of the cabin I found something. Not footprints exactly, but disturbances, places where the leaves had been shifted unnaturally. Small sections where the dirt showed through like something had knelt or crouched there. Right below the ridge, I went up again and stood where I had stood the day before. Looking down, I realized something else. From that spot, a person could watch me all day and I'd never know. The trees gave just enough cover. If someone sat still enough, I'd never see them. That's when my gut really started to twist. I stayed in the cabin all that day. I kept the fire low so no smoke would show. I kept my back to the wall and watched the window. The only time I went outside was to use the bathroom, and I did that quick, rifle in hand. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up, full gear on, rifle ready, flashlight close. I turned off the stove so there wouldn't be any glow through the cracks. I let the cold creep in just so I could listen. And around 2 in the morning, it started again. This time, the footsteps came from the left side of the cabin. They moved along the wall, slow and steady. I didn't breathe. I didn't move, just stared at the door. The steps paused by the window. I couldn't see anything, but I knew someone was standing there, not moving, watching. Then they walked around to the back, behind the cabin. No footsteps for a while, just silence. Then I heard it, a scraping sound, like something being dragged against wood. Maybe fingernails, maybe a stick. Then nothing. I stayed frozen like that until daylight. In the morning, I found 3 scratches on the back wall, deep carved into the wood, long and uneven, definitely not animal claws. They were too straight, too deliberate. I packed up to leave right after that. I didn't care how far the drive was. I was done. I loaded everything into the truck as fast as I could. I kept scanning the ridge the entire time. I thought about hiking up there one last time, just to see if I could find something, but my instincts screamed at me not to. As I was backing the truck up the narrow dirt path, I saw movement in the trees. Just a flicker, maybe a person, maybe not, but I didn't stop. I just kept driving. Hours later, when I finally hit pavement again, I felt like I could breathe. A week after I got home, I told my friend what happened. He laughed it off, said I was just spooked. But I knew what I heard. I knew what I saw. Someone was up there watching me. And when I looked back at the photos I took from the trip, mostly trees, sky, the cabin, one picture made my stomach turn. It was a shot from the ridge, looking down at the cabin. I had taken it on the first morning, before I heard anything strange. I hadn't noticed it before, but in the shadows, barely visible between 2 trees, there was a shape, human-sized, standing still, facing the cabin. I never went back. Ending detailed and clear. I never found out who it was. I never told the police because, technically, nothing happened. No one broke in. No one stole anything. There were no clear tracks, no face, no confrontation. Just footsteps, scratches, and a presence that shouldn't have been there. But I know what I experienced. I know someone was up there, night after night, watching me from the ridge. It wasn't random. Felt too controlled, too slow, like they had done it before. Maybe I was lucky. Maybe they were waiting for something. Maybe I left just in time. Whatever the reason, that cabin's just a shell now. A place in the woods where someone watches from the trees, waiting. I didn't expect much when I booked that cabin. I just needed to get away. Not because anything dramatic had happened in my life, but because I'd been sitting on the first 3 chapters of my novel for over 8 months. I kept telling myself I'd finish it when I had the time, when things calmed down, when I wasn't distracted. Of course, none of that ever happened. So I figured the only way I'd ever get anything done was if I physically removed myself from everything. I found the place on a rental site, buried under listings of lakeside homes and tourist cottages. It wasn't flashy. 1 bedroom, wood stove, no Wi-Fi. The listing had 3 photos, 2 of the outside and 1 of a basic kitchen. That was it. I liked that. I didn't want a vacation home with a hot tub and a game room. I wanted to be somewhere I could hear myself think. Somewhere nobody would bother me. The cabin was in northern Vermont, about 2 hours from any major town. I packed a few days' worth of groceries, my laptop, notebooks, and some clothes, then drove the 6 hours from my apartment. I remember the last 30 minutes of the drive clearly. There were no streetlights, no gas stations, just narrow, winding roads and dense woods. My cell signal vanished about 10 miles from the cabin. I got there just after 6 in the evening. It was colder than I thought it would be for late September. The sun was already down behind the trees, and the shadows made everything look darker than it should have been. The cabin was tucked about 50 yards off a gravel road, partially hidden by overgrown brush and a few dying pine trees. It didn't have a mailbox or a sign, just a crooked wooden post with faded red numbers on it. 1149. The driveway was uneven. My little sedan scraped the bottom more than once before I reached the flat patch where I could park. I left the car running while I got out and checked the door. The owner had left a key in a rusty combination lockbox under the porch. The code had been emailed to me the day before. When I stepped inside, the air was stale. Not moldy, not rotting, just untouched. It felt like nobody had been in there for at least a year, maybe more. The place was exactly as the photos had shown. Wood-paneled walls, old couch, narrow bed against the far wall. The kitchen was tiny, 2-burner stove, sink, old refrigerator with a top freezer that looked like it hadn't been defrosted since the 80s. There was a door in the corner, leading to what I assumed was a bathroom, and another door, one I hadn't seen in the photos, near the back wall. I didn't open that second door the first night. I was tired from the drive and more focused on getting my food into the fridge and figuring out how the old propane heater worked. Once I got settled, I made some tea and sat at the little desk by the window. I opened my laptop and tried to write. I got maybe half a page in before I fell asleep on the couch. The next morning, I woke up early. The air was cold and smelled faintly of wood and something like old leather. My back ached from sleeping in a weird position. I boiled some water for coffee and tried to shake off the grogginess. When I opened the door to the bathroom, I was pleasantly surprised. The toilet was clean. There was even a little tub with a curtain. The hot water took a while, but it worked. I figured I'd get used to the cold nights and weird quiet. It wasn't bad. It was what I wanted. I spent most of that day writing. For the first time in months, my fingers were flying across the keyboard. I wasn't checking my phone. I wasn't thinking about the outside world. I got into a rhythm. Every few hours I'd stretch, heat up something simple to eat, then get back to it. I wrote almost 3,000 words that day. I went to bed feeling proud of myself. But something woke me around 2:30 in the morning. It was faint, just a sound, a short, metallic rattle, then nothing. I sat up in bed, still half asleep, and listened. The cabin was dead silent. I thought maybe it had been the wind, but when I looked out the window, the trees weren't moving. No wind at all. I tried to forget about it and went back to bed. The next day was the same as the first, writing, eating, stretching, writing again. I had found a routine, but the sound came back the next night. Same time, 2:30 a.m., same short, rattling sound. But this time I could tell where it came from. The back of the cabin. That door. I stared at it for a long time before getting out of bed. I turned on the lamp, crossed the room quietly, and pressed my ear to the wood. I didn't hear anything at first, just silence. Then, the faintest sound of movement, like something shifting on concrete. Just for a second, then gone. I didn't open the door. The next morning, I decided I needed to at least check. I had to know what was behind it. I unlocked the door and turned the handle slowly. The hinges creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside was a narrow staircase leading down into a dark space. I reached for the flashlight I had packed in my bag and stepped onto the first stair. The air down there was colder, much colder. It hit me in the face like a damp cloth. The flashlight beam caught the outline of an unfinished basement. Concrete walls, wooden beams, old shelves. I saw a broken down chair in the corner, a few rusted cans of paint, and a pile of wood. It looked like any other basement, but there were scratches on the far wall. They weren't obvious, just faint lines low to the ground. I had to walk closer to see them properly. They weren't deep, but they were long, as if someone or something had been clawing at the wall. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or some animal that had gotten in, maybe years ago. Still, I didn't like being down there. I went back up and locked the door. That night, I didn't sleep. The sound came again, louder this time, not just a rattle, but movement, shuffling. I lay there with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling. My flashlight was on the nightstand next to me. I grabbed it, pointed it at the door. The noise stopped. Around 4 a.m., I finally fell asleep again. The following morning, I checked the basement again. This time, I saw something new. On the floor, near the back corner, there were marks, like something had been dragged. Faint lines across the dusty concrete, starting near the wall and stopping halfway across the room. And near those lines, small pieces of what looked like fingernails. I stood there staring at them for a long time. They weren't animal claws. They were human, small, chipped, slightly yellowed, like they'd been ripped off or broken during a struggle. I didn't touch them. I just backed up the stairs slowly and locked the door again. That whole day, I didn't write. I sat at the desk, trying to think, trying to tell myself I was being paranoid. But the more I replayed everything in my head, the worse it got. I thought about the lockbox outside, the lack of Wi-Fi, the complete isolation. I hadn't even seen another car on the road when I arrived. That night, I barely slept. I kept the flashlight in my hand. The noises started at 2 a.m. this time. Not just rattling, full-on dragging sounds, something moving below the floorboards. I heard creaks like footsteps. I couldn't move. I just lay there paralyzed. Then silence. The next morning, I made my decision. I was leaving. I didn't care if I lost my rental deposit. I didn't care if I hadn't finished my book. Something was wrong in that basement, and I wasn't going to stay another night. But when I got to the car, it wouldn't start. I tried the ignition 5 times. Nothing. The battery was dead. I opened the hood, checked the cables. Everything looked fine, but it was useless. I had no signal, no neighbors, no phone line. I was stuck. That afternoon, I forced myself to go down into the basement again. I didn't want to, but I had to know. I had to see if I could find anything, tools, a generator, anything. That's when I found the trapdoor. It was hidden under the pile of firewood in the corner. A square panel in the floor with a metal ring set into the wood. Pulled it open. There was a tunnel. Low, narrow, dirt walls reinforced with old beams. It went down at a slight angle, disappearing into the dark. I don't know why I went in. Maybe I was desperate. Maybe I thought there was something I could use. But I crawled in, flashlight in hand, heart pounding. It went down about 30 feet. Then it opened into a small chamber. And in that chamber, there was a mattress, stained, torn, covered in what looked like old, dried blood. Next to it, bones, small bones, human-sized, and near the wall, scratches. Hundreds of them, all at about knee height. Some were smeared with what looked like blood, some fresher than others. There were ropes tied to a pipe, rusted, frayed, stained. That's when I realized what this place was. Someone had kept people down here. Not recently, maybe, but the scratches on the wall, the fingernails upstairs, the dragging sounds, someone or something was still here. I ran. I crawled out of the tunnel, bolted up the stairs, and locked the basement door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat with my back against the wall, flashlight pointed at the door, waiting for morning. At sunrise, I packed everything I could into my bag. I didn't plan to stay at the cabin for long. I just needed a break. Life had been dragging me down for a while. City noise, constant deadlines, the same tired routine every day. I thought being alone for a while would help me reset. I wasn't looking for anything dramatic, just peace. But things didn't go that way. The cabin belonged to a friend of my cousin. He said I could use it for a week, maybe more. It was out in northern British Columbia. Thick pine forest, endless gravel roads, no cell signal. Sounded perfect. The place wasn't in a town or even close to one. You had to take a paved highway for a few hours, then cut down a dirt logging road for almost 40 minutes before reaching a chain gate. After that, it was just trees, silence, and the sound of your own footsteps. I reached the place around 3:30 p.m. It was late autumn, and the sun was already starting to dip. The sky was gray, the clouds heavy, the cold creeping in through the windshield. The cabin itself looked small and worn out, but not in bad shape. A rectangle of weathered wood and a rusty metal chimney poking up at one side. The clearing around it was about 20 feet across, the rest all tall trees packed tight like walls. No neighbors, no power lines, no noise. I turned off the engine and sat for a while. Everything was still, so still that I could hear my own heartbeat. Took me a minute to realize just how quiet things were. No wind, no birds, not even the sound of trees creaking. Just a deep silence that made you feel like you weren't supposed to be there. I unloaded my stuff. A duffel bag with clothes, a backpack with supplies, and a cooler with food. The inside of the cabin was basic, with stove, old kitchen with a propane burner, a table, and one small bed against the far wall. No electricity, no plumbing, just a rain barrel outside and an outhouse about 50 yards into the woods. I set up my sleeping bag, lit a few candles, and made some soup from a can. It was peaceful in a way that felt old and unfamiliar. The kind of peace where you're forced to listen to your own thoughts whether you want to or not. That first night, I slept surprisingly well. The second day, I took a walk. There were no trails, but I followed a faint track that looked like it had been made by someone hauling logs years ago. It led deeper into the woods. The farther I went, the thicker the trees got, and the harder it was to tell where I was going. But I kept track. I broke twigs on one side of trees so I could follow them back. It was cold, but I was dressed for it. I walked for maybe an hour and saw nothing but more trees. No animals, no birds, no movement. Felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. That night, something strange happened. I was in bed reading an old magazine I'd brought. The wood stove was burning low, casting flickers of orange on the walls. Around 11:30 p.m., just as I was drifting off, I heard a sound. It was light, faint, a crunch, then another, then silence. It sounded like footsteps on dry leaves, but spaced out too far. Not the kind of steps you'd hear from a squirrel or raccoon. These were heavier, more deliberate. I sat up and listened hard. The sound didn't come again. I tried to shake it off. Maybe a branch fell, or something small moved around outside. I blew out the candle, got under the blanket, and tried to forget about it. But it happened again the next night. This time it was louder. It came from the left side of the cabin, toward the trees. Crunch, pause, crunch. Then nothing. I held my breath. I didn't move. My eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling. I didn't hear anything else. After a long time, I finally convinced myself it was probably an animal passing through. Maybe a deer, maybe a bear. I didn't get much sleep that night. By the fourth night, things got worse. I had just started cooking when I heard something from outside. It was faint, like wood tapping on wood. A short, dull thock, thock, thock. I froze. It wasn't close, but not far either. Maybe 30 or 40 feet into the woods. I stepped outside slowly, holding the pot in my hand like a weapon. The sky was darkening, and the air was colder than before. I scanned the trees but saw nothing. The tapping stopped. I waited for a while, my breath fogging in front of me. Nothing moved. No sound. Eventually, I went back inside and locked the door. It was just a simple latch, nothing that would hold against anything determined. I sat at the table and didn't touch my food. I started noticing other small things. Scratches on the doorframe that I hadn't seen before. A faint smell of something foul near the woodpile. Footprints in the soft dirt behind the cabin that were too long to be mine. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe animals. Maybe some old marks I hadn't noticed. Maybe I was overthinking it, but it felt wrong. I kept a hatchet by my bed that night. The fifth night is when I knew I wasn't alone. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Not random ones this time. These were slow, careful, coming around the cabin. I lay still, holding the hatchet close, my ears straining. They stopped by the back wall, then moved again, this time toward the front door. I sat up quietly and held my breath. Then came a soft knock. It wasn't loud, just a single knock. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't go near the door. Nothing else happened for the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed my stuff. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just packed. I threw everything into my car and started driving back down the logging road. My hands were shaking the whole time. I didn't stop to check anything. I didn't even close the cabin door behind me. But here's the part that stuck with me. About 15 minutes into the drive, I saw something ahead of me. Just a shape, tall, still, at the edge of the trees right where the road curved. At first I thought it was a signpost or dead tree, but as I got closer, it moved. It stepped back slowly into the woods and disappeared. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I just kept going, heart racing, stomach in knots. When I finally hit the highway, I didn't stop until I was back in the city. I didn't tell anyone, not for weeks. When I did, people laughed or shrugged it off, said maybe I'd had a bad dream or imagined things. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know I wasn't alone out there. I still don't know who or what was watching me, or why they didn't try anything worse. But I've never been back to that area. I don't hike anymore. I don't camp alone. I don't even like silence the way I used to. That trip changed something in me, because sometimes, out in the middle of nowhere, where no one can hear you and no help can come, you're not as alone as you think. It was mid-October when I decided to go up to my uncle's old hunting cabin in northern Michigan. It had been empty for over a decade, ever since he passed away. My aunt kept the place but hadn't visited in years. She let me use it after I asked, mostly because she thought it might be falling apart and could use a set of eyes on it. I had taken some time off work and wanted to spend a week somewhere quiet, far from traffic, phones, and the stress of the city. I wasn't really going to hunt. Just needed the silence, the cold air, and maybe a few long walks in the woods. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road, about 25 miles from the nearest small town. There were no neighbors nearby, no cell service, and no Wi-Fi. It was the kind of place where if something went wrong, you'd have to wait until you could either hike out or someone happened to pass by on the main road, which they rarely did. I drove up early on a Sunday. The air was crisp, and the leaves were deep reds, oranges, and fading yellows. It was beautiful, like something off a postcard. I had packed everything I thought I'd need. Food for the week, extra firewood in the bed of my truck, a battery-powered lantern, a solar charger for my GPS, a knife, a pistol, and a first aid kit. The road was rough but familiar. I'd been to the cabin a few times as a kid, though never alone. The cabin itself was simple, one room with a small bathroom built on the back. It had an old wood stove, a cot, a small table, and shelves filled with dusty pans, plates, and a few old hunting magazines. There were spider webs in every corner, and the whole place smelled like dust, dry wood, and mouse droppings. I spent the first day cleaning. I swept out the place, lit a fire, and made sure the water pump still worked. Everything was quiet. No cars, no voices, just the wind through the trees. The first few days were peaceful. I woke up early, made coffee on the old gas burner, and went for long walks down the logging paths behind the cabin. I saw deer tracks, raccoon prints, and once what looked like bear scat. I kept my distance. I spent the evenings reading or just sitting by the fire, staring at it. The silence was something I didn't realize I had missed so much. I barely thought about my job or bills or people. I just let my mind wander. It was on the fourth night that I noticed something strange. I was sitting on the porch, bundled up in a thick hoodie and sipping hot tea. The air had dropped to just above freezing, and the stars were clearer than I'd seen in years. The moon wasn't out, so everything was very dark beyond the porch light. That's when I noticed it. Something was reflecting light out in the woods. A small flash, not a big one, just enough to catch my eye. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe eyes catching the porch light. But it wasn't the right color. It was more silver than green or yellow. And it didn't move like eyes do. It was still. Then, just as I stood to get a better look, it disappeared, like something had stepped behind a tree. I stayed out there for a while, watching, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I went inside, locked the door, and told myself it was probably just a trick of light. The woods play tricks at night. I knew that. The next morning, I walked in that direction. I didn't find anything. No signs of anyone. No trash. No broken branches. But the trees were thick, and there was plenty of room to hide. Still, it felt stupid to worry. I hadn't seen any sign of people since I got here. It was just one little flash of light. Could have been anything. A reflection off an old beer can stuck in the dirt. A spider web catching the light. Anything. But then, that night, it happened again. Only this time, it was closer. I had gone out to pee behind the cabin since the indoor plumbing only worked when the pump cooperated, and it had been acting up that day. I didn't bring a flashlight, just went out with the porch light behind me. While I was finishing up, I heard a soft crunch, like a footstep on dead leaves. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. I froze and turned toward the sound. Again, there was nothing, just darkness. I waited, heart picking up speed. Then another crunch. Closer. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. Just slowly backed up toward the porch, then turned and went inside, locking the door behind me. I stood there, lights off, looking out the small window beside the door. I saw nothing. No movement. No light this time. But something had been out there. Something was watching. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the cabin made me sit up and listen. I kept the pistol beside me, though I wasn't even sure what I'd do with it in the dark. At some point, I drifted off out of exhaustion. The next day, I did something I hadn't planned to. I checked the truck. I wanted to be sure it would start, just in case I needed to leave quickly. It fired up fine. I didn't pack, but I made sure my things were easy to grab if needed. Then I walked again, this time a wider circle around the cabin. I still didn't find anything. No footprints, no wrappers, nothing. But the feeling was still there, like something was wrong. On the sixth night, I heard tapping. I had just turned off the lantern and was trying to get comfortable on the cot. It was cold enough that I kept my hoodie on under the blanket. Then 3 light taps on the window by the door. Soft, precise, not wind, not branches. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling. The window had a small curtain, but it didn't cover the bottom edge. Anyone standing there could see in. After a long time, I sat up, holding the pistol, and walked to the door. I moved slowly, quietly. When I reached the window, I crouched low and looked out through the bottom edge. I saw something move. It wasn't clear, just the shape of a person stepping back into the dark. No flashlight, no noise, just a shadow that blended back into the trees. That was enough for me. I stayed up the rest of the night with the fire going and the pistol on the table. I didn't turn the lights back off. I didn't sleep. I just waited for morning. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I packed everything as fast as I could. I threw it all into the truck and didn't even eat breakfast. I didn't clean the dishes. I didn't check the water pump. I just got out. As I pulled out of the driveway, I looked back once, through the mirror. That's when I saw it again, standing just at the edge of the tree line. A man. He was tall, wearing something dark, maybe a coat. I couldn't see his face. He didn't move, just stood there, perfectly still, watching me drive away. I didn't stop. I drove straight to town and checked into a small roadside motel. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. I just said I cut the trip short. The next day, I drove home. Weeks later, I got a package in the mail. It was from the sheriff's office near the cabin. Inside was a short note. "We found this near the cabin while investigating another case. Thought you should have it." Along with the note was a photograph. It had been printed from a trail cam, one I didn't know existed, maybe set up by a nearby hunter. The image showed my truck parked outside the cabin, and behind it, off to the side in the trees, was the same man, closer this time, looking directly at the camera. I never went back to that cabin. I told my aunt to sell it. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. Maybe he was just watching, maybe not. But I know this, he had been out there the whole time, watching, waiting, closer each night. And I never heard him speak a word, never saw a flashlight, never heard a door, just soft footsteps and tapping on glass, and the sound of someone who knew exactly how to move through the woods without being seen. I needed to get away for a while, not from something dramatic, just life. Noise, people, everything that comes with the city. I had a few vacation days built up and I wanted a full reset. I wanted silence, no distractions, and somewhere where I could just think. I didn't want beaches or hotels. I wanted something simple. That's how I ended up booking a small cabin deep in the mountains of northern Idaho. The place was remote, too remote maybe. The cabin sat off a narrow dirt road, about 20 minutes from the closest paved highway. No internet, no phone service, no neighbors for miles. It didn't even have a proper address. Just coordinates the owner sent me in an email after I paid through a small private rental site. There were a few reviews from people who stayed there, saying it was peaceful and quiet, surrounded by thick pine forest. That's what I wanted. Complete quiet. Felt like the right choice. I drove up early in the morning, hoping to reach the cabin before dark. The last few miles of the road were rough, and my old Honda wasn't made for that kind of terrain, but it made it. By the time I parked and stepped out, I could already feel it. Nothing but wind, the soft creak of trees, and the smell of pine. The cabin itself was small but clean. Just one room with a bed, wood stove, small kitchen, and a bathroom with running water thanks to a well. The owner had stocked the place with firewood and left a note with simple instructions for the generator, which I'd only need for the fridge and a few lights. I unpacked slowly, checked every corner of the cabin, then walked around outside. The trees surrounded the place so tightly that you couldn't see 20 feet in any direction. There were no trails nearby, just thick forest sloping uphill behind the cabin and steeply downhill out front. The road I came in on curved down through the trees and vanished from sight. Once I shut off the car, it was like the world went silent. That's what I came for. The first day passed quietly. I spent the afternoon reading, then made some simple dinner on the gas stove. I turned in early, tired from the drive. That night, I slept hard. No city sounds, no traffic, no sirens. Just the occasional knock of branches outside. Felt good. The next morning, I took my coffee out to the small porch and just sat, watching the trees. There was no real view, just dense forest, but it was peaceful. I sat there for a long time, just enjoying being alone. That's when I noticed something strange up the hill behind the cabin. At first, I thought it was an animal. I saw movement, just a flicker between the trees, maybe 30 yards up the slope. I waited, expecting to see a deer or maybe a bear, but nothing came out. Still, I had that uneasy feeling, like something was watching me. I brushed it off. I knew my mind was just playing tricks. I wasn't used to this kind of silence, and being totally alone made every little thing feel bigger than it was. Later that day, I decided to hike up the slope behind the cabin to get a better view. There wasn't a trail, so I just picked my way through the trees. It was thick with undergrowth and loose rock. After maybe 15 minutes of climbing, I found a small ledge that gave me a partial view through the trees. I could barely see the roof of the cabin below. That's when I noticed the flattened patch of ground nearby. It wasn't natural. The pine needles and leaves had been pushed aside. There was a spot about 6 feet long, shaped like a person might have been lying there. Fresh, too, maybe from last night or even earlier that day. My stomach tightened. I crouched down and looked closer. There were a few broken twigs, and the ground was pressed down in a way that didn't look like it came from an animal. I stood up and scanned the woods around me. Nothing. No sound. No movement. I headed back down, slower than before, constantly turning to look behind me. Once I got back to the cabin, I locked the door behind me and stayed inside the rest of the day. I kept trying to explain it away. Maybe an animal, maybe someone had been hunting up here, maybe just a weird shape in the ground that I misread. But my instincts told me something was off. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the fire low and turned off all the lights. I lay there listening. Every small creak in the walls felt louder than it should. At one point, just after midnight, I thought I heard something on the porch. Maybe the soft tap of a footstep, just once. I held my breath and waited. Nothing. I stayed still for almost an hour, then drifted off sometime before dawn. The next morning, I checked the porch. There was a footprint. Not a full one, just the edge of a boot print near the step. The soil was dry and didn't hold shape well, but there was no mistaking it. Someone had stood there. I looked around but saw no other prints. Whoever it was must have stood still, then walked off into the woods. I felt cold. That day, I didn't leave the cabin at all. I kept the door locked and the windows closed. I stayed away from the back wall facing the hillside. I felt like I was being watched. More than once, I thought I saw movement in the trees behind the cabin, but it was always just a flicker, too quick to be sure. By the third day, I wanted to leave, but there was a problem. The road out had washed out. It rained heavily overnight. When I drove down the dirt path the next morning, I hit a spot where a chunk of the road had collapsed from runoff. Mud and water had eaten away part of the edge, and the ground was soft and sinking. My car couldn't make it through. I tried to back up and find another way, but the road dead-ended uphill not far from the cabin. I was stuck until the ground dried out. I had food for a few more days, enough water, and the generator was still running fine. But the idea of staying longer didn't sit well. Not after everything I'd seen. That afternoon, I thought I'd take a walk down the road on foot to see if I could find a spot where I might get a weak phone signal. Maybe high ground near a clearing. I packed a small bag, locked up the cabin, and started walking. I got about a mile down before I saw the man. He was standing off the road about 30 feet into the trees, not moving. He wasn't wearing hiking gear or carrying anything, just jeans and a long brown coat. He had a short beard and a cap pulled down low. He didn't wave. He didn't call out. He just stood there watching me. I froze. I didn't say anything. I just stared back, trying to figure out if he was real. Maybe a hunter? Maybe someone camping? But something felt wrong. He didn't move. I took a slow step back, then another. He didn't follow, didn't speak, just stood there staring. I turned around and walked back toward the cabin without looking back. When I got there, I locked the door and closed all the blinds. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the lights off and sat in the dark with a flashlight, listening. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something behind the cabin again. A soft sound, branches snapping, slow footsteps in the leaves. I stayed still. The sound stopped after a few minutes. I waited until sunrise before I dared to move. The next day, I packed everything. I didn't care if the road was washed out. I was going to try and get out anyway. I loaded up the car, got in, and drove. I made it to the washout, got out, and looked at it. Still muddy, but passable if I took it slow. I backed up for speed and drove forward. The car slid halfway through. The back wheels sank. I floored it. Mud sprayed everywhere, but I got traction and pulled through to the other side. I didn't stop driving until I hit pavement. Once I had signal, I pulled over and called the cabin owner. No answer. I left a message and told him someone had been watching the cabin. I also called the local sheriff's office. They said they'd send someone out to check, but sounded like they'd heard similar calls before. I never went back. A week later, I checked the listing. It was still up. Same photos, same reviews, no mention of anything strange. But I know what I saw, and I still wonder who that man was, what he was doing up on the hillside, why he watched the cabin for days without coming closer. Or maybe he had come closer. Maybe he was the one on the porch. Maybe he was lying on that flattened patch of ground behind the trees, just waiting, watching. I think about it sometimes, how quiet it was, how easy it would be for someone to vanish out there. No signal, no witnesses, just trees and silence. I don't camp anymore. I don't rent remote cabins. And I never go anywhere without checking if there's a second road in and out. Because I've learned, sometimes you're not as alone as you think you are. I booked the cabin because I needed space. Not emotional space or anything poetic like that. I just needed a place where I could be alone and not think about work, or my phone, or people asking me why I haven't done anything big in life. So, I found a listing online for a small off-grid cabin in a wooded area about 6 hours from my apartment in the city. The photos showed a single-story wooden structure, old but well-kept, with a tin roof and a wide porch. The owner wrote in the description that there was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and no neighbors within walking distance. That's what sold me. I packed light. A few changes of clothes, a couple paperbacks, 2 flashlights, a knife, and a week's worth of groceries. I filled the car with fuel, shut off my phone, and hit the road. The drive was uneventful until the last hour, when the paved highway turned to dirt. That's when I realized how isolated this place was. I passed no cars, no farms, no cabins. Just trees, tight and tall, on either side of the narrow path. The sun had already started going down by the time I reached the gate. A heavy, rusted thing that squealed as I pulled it open. The cabin was exactly as advertised. It sat low among the trees with a wide front porch that looked out toward a small clearing. The grass was high but dry, and the air smelled like pine and something faintly earthy, almost like mushrooms. I turned off the engine and stepped out. No wind, no birds, just me and the trees and that smell. I unloaded my things and went inside. The front door creaked, not like in a horror movie way, but like wood that hadn't been oiled in years. Inside, it was dim. Dust floated in the late orange light coming through the windows. The floorboards were thick and rough beneath my boots. The furniture was simple. A small table with 2 chairs, a wood stove, a sagging couch, and a single bed pushed against the far wall. There was also a small kitchen area with an old propane stove and a cooler where the owner had left a block of ice, like he said he would. I didn't do much that first night. I read for an hour, made some pasta, and then walked out onto the porch with a flashlight. I scanned the trees. The beam of light disappeared into blackness like it was being swallowed. There were no stars, just a dull gray sky and the thick shapes of the trees. I slept okay. The bed was hard and the air was cold, but I was tired. What woke me around 3 a.m. wasn't a sound, but a feeling. Something in the room felt off, like the air had changed. I sat up and listened. No animals, no wind, but the smell, that mushroom earthy smell, was stronger now, almost sour. I got up and walked around with the flashlight. I checked the kitchen. Nothing. The windows. Nothing. I opened the door and looked outside. Nothing. I told myself I was just not used to the silence and went back to bed. The next morning, I noticed something weird. There was a square in the middle of the living room floor. Not a painted square or anything obvious, just a slightly different tone in the wood grain. It looked like the floor had been patched at some point, but with boards from a different tree. When I stepped on it, it felt a little hollow. I knelt down and ran my hand over it. The seams were tight, but I could feel the faintest groove around the edges. I got a knife from the kitchen and carefully worked it into one of the seams. With some effort, I managed to lift it. It was a trapdoor. Underneath was a square hole in the floor about 3 feet wide. It dropped into complete darkness. A wooden ladder led down into it, but I couldn't see the bottom. I leaned in and sniffed. That same mushroomy, wet smell came up from below, stronger this time. I didn't go down that day. I closed the trapdoor and put a heavy chair on top of it. The rest of that day was normal. I made breakfast, took a short walk down one of the barely there trails behind the cabin, and spent the evening reading. But all day, my mind kept returning to that hole in the floor. Why hadn't the owner mentioned it? What was down there? A root cellar? A well? A storm shelter? That night I dreamt of falling. Just falling down and down in total darkness. By the third day, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I waited until mid-afternoon when the sun was high. I opened the trapdoor again, and this time, I went down. The wooden ladder creaked under my weight. I went slowly, one step at a time, until my boots hit dirt. The space below was just high enough to stand in. I turned on my flashlight. The beam hit concrete walls. It wasn't natural at all. It was a man-made basement, square and small, maybe 10 by 10 feet. No furniture, just dirt floor and 4 walls made from poured concrete. The smell was overwhelming now, wet, earthy, sharp. In the far corner, I saw something that looked like a pile of clothes. I walked over. My flashlight flicked slightly as I moved, and for a moment I thought I saw something glisten. It wasn't just clothes. It was a backpack, half-rotted, pair of torn jeans, a boot. I froze. This wasn't from some old homesteader. These were modern. The boot had a visible Nike logo. The jeans had a ripped Levi's tag. I looked closer. Inside the backpack was a small journal, water-damaged, most of the pages unreadable. But one page near the front was still clear. It only had one line: "If anyone finds this, do not stay." I stood there staring at it for a long time. My flashlight dimmed again, like the batteries were dying. I turned around and climbed out fast. I closed the trapdoor, and this time I stacked the chair, the cooler, and my suitcase on top. I didn't want to look at it again. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing sounds, tiny clicks, like movement below the floor, sometimes a groan. At one point, I thought I heard the wood flex, like something was pushing against it from underneath. But when I got up to check, nothing had moved. I sat awake for hours, listening. I wanted to believe I was imagining it. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. But around 4 a.m., I swear I felt the floor vibrate. Not like footsteps, like something shifting in the dirt. I didn't wait until morning. I packed my things in 15 minutes, tossed them in the car, and left. I didn't even lock the cabin. I just drove fast until I hit the main road, then kept driving until I had cell signal. I called the cabin owner, but the number was dead. I emailed him. It bounced. I reported the backpack and the basement to the local sheriff's office. A deputy called me back a few days later. He said they investigated. The backpack and clothes were gone. The trapdoor was nailed shut. No sign of a basement at all. He said it was probably just a storage crawl space. He sounded like he didn't care. I know what I saw. I know what I felt. Something was down there, and someone else had found it before me. I never heard back from the owner. The listing disappeared from the site. I check sometimes, just in case it comes back. It hasn't. I don't go into the woods anymore. I don't rent remote cabins. I don't trust silence. And I never, ever ignore a strange smell again. It was supposed to be a quiet week in the woods. I had taken time off work, something I rarely did, just to unplug from everything. No phone, no laptop, no meetings, no people. I found a small cabin deep in the northern Michigan woods through an old friend who didn't use the internet. He gave me directions written on a piece of paper, telling me that the place was far from town and had no cell signal, but it had running water, a wood stove, and solar power for lights. That was enough for me. The drive there was long. The last stretch was all dirt road, full of sharp turns and rough bumps. The trees grew thicker the deeper I went. It was early October. Leaves were starting to fall, covering the road in patches of brown and orange. I passed one old barn about 10 minutes before reaching the cabin, but otherwise, I saw no other signs of people. That was the idea. The cabin itself was just how I pictured it. It was small, one room with a bed, a wood stove in the corner, and a small table under a window. The bathroom was in an extension on the back, added on later, and had a working shower and toilet thanks to a water tank out back. There was no internet and the solar battery powered only a few light bulbs. I liked it that way. I needed to be alone. I spent the first day unloading, stacking firewood, testing the stove, and making sure everything worked. It did. I sat on the steps that evening and watched the sun set through the trees. Everything was quiet. No cars, no voices, just the rustling of leaves and the sound of a few birds calling as it got darker. I went to bed early, feeling calm. The second day was peaceful too. I read a bit, made simple food, walked in the woods near the cabin. I marked my trail with sticks so I wouldn't get lost. I didn't go far. That night it rained, lightly tapping the metal roof while I lay in bed. It was comforting. I slept better than I had in months. It was on the third day that something felt off. I woke up at dawn, opened the front door, and noticed boot prints in the dirt just outside the steps. They weren't mine. I wore wide hiking boots. These were narrow and longer. The pattern on the soles was different, zigzag lines. They led up to the porch, circled near the front, then went around the side of the cabin toward the back. I followed them slowly, trying not to make noise. The prints stopped near the water tank and disappeared into the woods. I looked out between the trees but saw nothing. No sound, no movement. I waited, then walked back to the front, trying to think logically. Maybe someone was hiking and came close by. Maybe they saw the cabin and got curious. But who hikes out this far in the middle of the week? And why walk all the way around the place? I felt watched after that. I stayed inside most of the day. I kept checking out the windows, trying not to make it obvious. Nothing. No prints by evening. I locked the door, blocked it with a chair, and left a kitchen knife beside my bed. I barely slept. The next morning, I saw the prints again. This time they were fresher. Same type, same direction. Only this time they came right up to the front window. Whoever it was had stood there, probably looking in while I was asleep. That changed everything. I got dressed fast and went out with a flashlight, following the prints again. They were deeper now, heavier. Whoever it was had been standing still for a while. The prints led back around the cabin again, to the rear water tank, and then vanished into the woods like before. I walked 10, maybe 15 feet in, but the trees were so thick, and the ground was soft with fallen leaves. The tracks faded. I couldn't follow them. I went back, locking the door again and pulling the blinds closed. I took the firewood inside. I didn't want to keep going out at night. That day I kept thinking, should I leave? There was no cell signal here. The car was parked down the slope near the edge of the woods. I'd have to walk almost 10 minutes to get to it. What if someone was watching me that whole time? What if they were waiting? That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the stove, knife beside me, listening. Around 3 a.m., I heard leaves crunch outside. Just 1 or 2 steps, then silence, then again. Very slow, careful movements. Not an animal. Animals are quicker, more random. This was careful, like someone trying to stay hidden. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The steps came closer to the front door and then stopped. I sat there for over an hour, just listening. Nothing else happened. No knock, no footsteps going away, just silence. When morning finally came, I looked out through a crack in the curtain. The prints were there again, right up to the door. He had stood there again, right outside in the dark. I needed to leave. I packed fast. Just essentials. Left the rest. I didn't even lock the cabin behind me. I ran through the trail to where I'd parked. The car was untouched. I got in, locked the doors, and drove. My hands were shaking the whole way out. Every time I rounded a bend in the dirt road, I expected to see someone standing there, or a tree blocking the path. I didn't stop driving until I reached the first gas station an hour and a half away. I asked the clerk if anyone had come in from that area in the last day or two. Described the boots. He shrugged and said no, but I wasn't sure if he was just saying that to move on. When I got home, I reported it to the local sheriff's office. They said they'd send someone out to check, but they weren't really interested. There was no break-in, no threat, just boot prints. Nothing they could do. I called my friend who told me about the cabin. He sounded surprised. Said nobody lived within miles of that place. Said he used to camp out there as a kid and never saw anyone around. But something about the way he said it made me uneasy, like he was holding something back. I never got any answers. I never went back. Weeks later, when I was finally settling back into normal life, I got a package at my door. No return address. Inside was a pair of muddy boots. Same pattern, same size. I burned them. I've always been the type who looks for peace in places most people try to avoid. Too much noise in the city, too many people in town, and even the countryside sometimes feels like it's filled with others trying to escape just like me. So when I took a long break from my job, I wanted to go somewhere really quiet. No cell service, no neighbors, no distractions. I wasn't looking for adventure or anything exciting. I just wanted to be alone for a while. That's how I ended up in that old cabin near the woods, tucked behind a logging road in the northern part of British Columbia. I'd found it while scanning satellite maps online, just clicking through forested areas for hours. There was no listing or anything official, just a note from a guy in an outdoor forum saying he'd stumbled across a rundown place when he took a wrong turn on a forestry service road during hunting season. No one seemed to own it, or at least no one had claimed it in years. The guy had posted a couple of grainy photos. It looked old, wooden, and rough, but it had 4 walls and a roof, and it wasn't marked on any land use maps I could find. That was exactly what I wanted, so I planned it out. I packed supplies for a couple of weeks, canned food, camping gear, extra blankets, tools, batteries, water filters, you name it. I brought my old truck and followed GPS coordinates as far as I could. When the logging road got too narrow and the forest started pushing in on both sides, I stopped the truck, strapped on a hiking pack, and walked the rest of the way in. It took almost 2 hours, bushwhacking with a machete through sections where the old road was swallowed by trees. Then I saw it. The cabin was there, sitting in a small clearing, quiet and solid. It looked older than the pictures and more broken down. The roof sagged in the middle. The wood on one side was black from rain and moss, but the door was there, still on its hinges. The windows had no glass, just open squares with thick boards nailed across most of them. I stood in front of it, breathing hard, soaked in sweat, and stared at it like I just discovered something sacred. It was perfect. I stayed the first night in my tent, just outside the cabin, to be safe. I didn't know what kind of animals used it or if anyone actually still came here, but nothing happened that night. Just wind in the trees and a few distant cracks in the forest. Maybe branches falling. Nothing that felt off. The next day, I cleaned out the inside. It was dusty and filled with bits of broken furniture. There was a rusty metal frame of an old bed in one corner, a few shelves with empty cans and rat droppings in some places. But it was dry inside. That was all I needed. I set up my sleeping bag in the corner furthest from the windows and cleared the area around the cabin. I set up a cooking area outside using rocks and a grill. I hung my food in a bag from a tree to keep it safe from bears. For the first few days, it was exactly what I needed. Quiet, still, just the sound of wind moving through the trees and birds, and sometimes the faraway drone of what might have been a plane or logging machine in the distance. I stayed busy during the days, chopping firewood, clearing paths, reading old books, fixing things around the cabin to make it more comfortable. At night, I wrote in a notebook, cooked basic meals, and sat by the fire. I even felt like I could stay here for a month or 2, but something changed around the 5th night. Started small. I noticed a few things moved around outside the cabin in the morning. A piece of bark I'd used to cover some gear was lying 10 feet away. My folding chair was turned over. I figured maybe a raccoon had messed with it. Then I started seeing tracks. Not boot prints, not paws, just these long, shallow marks in the dirt like something had been dragged. I thought maybe it was a porcupine or even a deer scraping the ground. I kept brushing it off. But every night after that, I slept a little lighter. On the 7th day, I went out farther into the woods, just to explore. I didn't go far, maybe a mile, but I came across a strange spot. It looked like an old pile of cut logs, but some of them were tied together with wire. Not rope, wire, like someone had been trying to make something. A structure, maybe. It had been abandoned long ago. The wire was rusted and the logs were half buried in moss, but it felt out of place. That evening, when I got back to the cabin, something was wrong. The door, which I always latched with a stick from the inside, was hanging open. I hadn't left it that way. Inside, some of my things were shifted. Nothing was taken, nothing broken, just moved. My sleeping bag was half unrolled. My gear bag was open. A can of food was on the floor. I tried to tell myself I'd made a mistake, that maybe I didn't latch the door right. Maybe I knocked over the can, but my body didn't believe it. That night I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, listening. I heard something around 1 a.m. A slow, light step outside. Then another. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't heavy enough. It wasn't a raccoon either. It moved too slowly. I didn't move from where I was lying, but I could feel my whole body tense up. My fingers gripped the handle of my hunting knife under my sleeping bag. I didn't make a sound. Then the sound stopped. Total silence. After 5 minutes, I slowly sat up. I didn't turn on my headlamp. I just waited. I stayed that way for hours. In the morning, I went outside. Nothing obvious, but the air felt different, like something had shifted. For the next few days, I tried to ignore it. I didn't want to leave. I felt like if I left, it would mean I was running from something. But the tension in me kept building. I found more marks in the dirt. I found a piece of cloth hanging from a tree limb. It wasn't mine. It was a torn corner of some kind of old shirt, frayed and stiff like it had been out in the weather a long time. And one morning I saw the small pile. Someone or something had stacked 5 rocks right outside the cabin door. They were clean, smooth, placed carefully on top of each other. That broke me. I didn't know what it meant, but it wasn't nature. It wasn't animals. That was a choice someone made. I left that afternoon. I packed everything fast. Didn't even clean up. I stuffed my gear, rolled up my sleeping bag, took my water jugs and stove, and left food behind. I hiked fast through the woods. I didn't stop for breaks. When I got to the truck, I kept looking behind me. Even after I started the engine and drove away, I didn't feel safe. I didn't stop until I hit a town 2 hours away. I slept in the back seat in a gas station parking lot. That was 2 years ago. I never told anyone where the cabin was. I don't think it was really abandoned. Not in the way I thought. Someone had been there before me, and maybe someone never left. I didn't see them, but they saw me. I'm sure of it. They watched me sleep. They waited. Maybe they were trying to scare me away, or maybe they were just waiting for me to stay longer. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed another night, but I didn't want to find out. I still look at cabins sometimes online in books, but I never go back. I don't hike as far anymore. I stay where people are. I don't need that kind of quiet again. Not ever. That kind of quiet comes with things you don't want to hear. I booked the cabin because I needed a break. Not a break from work or from people really, but from noise. From the city, the phone, the constant buzz of everything. Life had gotten loud. Too loud. I couldn't think anymore. Every night I would lie down and feel this tightness in my chest, like something was always about to go wrong. It was early spring, just after the snow had melted in the higher elevations, and I found a listing online for a small off-grid cabin about 3 hours from my town. It wasn't in the middle of nowhere, but it wasn't close to anything either. No neighbors, no internet, no power lines. The pictures showed a basic wooden structure with a tin roof, a small porch, and a trail that led off into the woods. There was a little wood stove inside, a simple bed, and a few basic tools. The owner said the cabin had no plumbing, but there was a stream nearby, and they left firewood stocked in a locked metal bin under the porch. I packed food, a camp stove, water jugs, a few books, and planned to stay there for 5 days. The drive there was peaceful. I left in the morning, drove past quiet towns, and eventually onto a narrow gravel road that twisted through dense pine forest. The last 20 minutes had no cell service. I parked in a small clearing at the end of the road, and from there, I hiked half a mile up a narrow footpath to the cabin. The place was exactly as advertised. The wood was weathered but solid. The tin roof clinked lightly in the breeze. Inside, it smelled like old pine and dry smoke. The tiny window let in soft yellow light through the trees, and everything was still. For the first day, I just let myself adjust. I sat on the porch, ate some crackers and cheese, read the first few chapters of a book, and let the silence settle around me. There were no voices, no cars, no music or phones. Only the wind, some birds, and the occasional creak of the trees. The second day, I started exploring. There was a rough path that led past the cabin and into the woods, and I followed it. The trees got denser as I went. I saw animal tracks in the dirt, old fallen branches, and once I stepped over what looked like a rusted fence post buried in the ground. I didn't go too far. I didn't want to get lost. I came back before sunset, started a small fire in the stove, made some noodles, and wrote in a small notebook I'd brought. I wrote about how quiet it was, about how I could hear my own heartbeat, about how I felt better already. But that night, something changed. I woke up suddenly around 2 a.m. The fire had gone out, and it was cold. Not freezing, but enough to feel the sting in my fingers and ears. I sat up to throw another log into the stove. That's when I heard something outside. It wasn't a clear sound, not a footstep, not an animal call. It was more like movement, a shifting sound, like something large moving through the woods, maybe 20 or 30 feet from the cabin. I froze, my ears strained. Then there was a snap, a twig, then silence. I told myself it was a deer, or an elk, maybe even a bear. Animals move around at night. The cabin wasn't soundproof, and things echo in the forest. I lit a candle, warmed up the room, and tried to sleep again. The next morning, I walked a small circle around the cabin. I didn't see any tracks, but to be fair, the ground was dry and hard. Nothing really left an imprint unless it was muddy. Still, the feeling stayed with me, like something had been near. That afternoon, I walked the trail again. A little farther this time, maybe a mile or so. I found an old tree that had been chopped down years ago. Not fallen, chopped. A clean cut at the base, now covered in moss. That struck me as strange. I hadn't seen anything to suggest that anyone came through here anymore. The trail felt forgotten. As I turned to head back, I noticed something behind a tree about 15 feet off the trail. At first I thought it was an animal, but when I stepped closer, I saw it was just a pile of clothing. Old clothing. A ripped jacket, some jeans, and a boot. Just one. They were dirty and faded, and clearly had been there for a long time. The boot had a tear down the side, and the jacket had a broken zipper. It gave me a weird feeling. I didn't touch anything. I just backed away and headed back to the cabin. My stomach felt tight again. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up. I kept thinking about the jacket, about who left it. Why would someone leave a boot? At some point, I must have dozed off, because I opened my eyes and it was morning. The sun was barely coming up. I stretched, got up, and stepped out onto the porch. That's when I saw it. A rock, a medium-sized rock sitting on the porch railing. It hadn't been there the night before. I was sure of it. I'd cleared off the railing to dry a rag after washing my hands, and it had been empty. Now there was a rock, smooth and round, just sitting there. I looked around. No sign of anything. No prints. No marks in the dirt. I picked up the rock. It didn't mean anything by itself, but it wasn't there before, and now it was. Something didn't feel right. I left the rock on the ground and tried to ignore it. I cooked oatmeal, sat inside, and stared at my notebook for a long time without writing. That afternoon, I tried to hike a new direction, just straight north from the cabin. The woods got thicker quickly, and I had to push branches out of my way. After maybe 10 minutes, I saw another old fence post. This one snapped in half, and then a rusted bucket half buried in the ground. I looked up, and that's when I saw the tree. It wasn't a big tree, maybe 20 feet tall, but something was tied around it. Rope. Several loops of rope wound tightly around the trunk. Some of it frayed, like it had been cut. The bark beneath was scarred and splintered. Next to it, stuck into the ground, was a shovel. The handle was cracked. The blade was rusted. That's when my body started to react. My mouth went dry. My hands felt shaky. I turned around and started walking fast. Not running, not yet, but faster than I should have. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door even though it didn't do much. It was just a wooden latch. I sat on the floor with my back against the bed. My heart was racing. I stayed inside the rest of the day. Ate jerky. Tried to calm down. I told myself again and again, maybe a hunter left the clothes. Maybe someone tried to build a deer blind or tie up gear and forgot it. Maybe the shovel had been there for years, but I couldn't explain the rock. I couldn't explain the rope marks. I couldn't explain why I suddenly felt like I was being watched. That night was the worst. I was lying in bed, fully dressed, with my boots near my feet. Couldn't sleep. I just stared at the window, waiting for the sky to lighten. Then, just past 3 a.m., I heard it again. Movement, closer this time, crunching leaves. A branch bent, and then footsteps. Not fast, not stomping, just slow, deliberate. I held my breath. Then something touched the doorknob. Not a wind, not an animal. I heard it click. Just once, a dry metal sound. The knob moving slightly. I sat up, reached for the small hatchet I kept next to the bed. The knob didn't turn again. I didn't move. I waited. Every second felt like an hour. Then silence again. When the sun rose, I opened the door slowly, hatchet in hand. There was nothing there. No marks. No one. But something was left again. Not a rock this time. A piece of cloth. It was folded once and placed on the step. It looked like it had been cut from a shirt. The edges were frayed, like with a knife. That's when I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed fast, threw everything into my pack. I left the dishes unwashed. I didn't care. I hiked back to my car, and for the first 15 minutes, I kept turning around, certain someone was behind me. When I reached the gravel road and saw my car, I felt the weight lift from my chest for the first time in 2 days. I got in, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station with people and noise and bright lights. I didn't report anything. What would I say? Someone left a rock? A piece of cloth? But I know this, someone was out there. Not an animal. Not a ghost. Person. A real, living person had come near that cabin in the night and left things. Watched me. Got close enough to touch the doorknob. And that person didn't want to be seen. That's what scares me most. Ending. It's been months since I left that cabin, but I still think about it. I still think about what might have happened if I had stayed one more night, if I had opened that door, if I had been too slow to hear the knob turn again. I still don't know who was out there. A hunter? A squatter? Someone hiding? Someone playing games? Or someone with worse intentions? I'll never know. And honestly, I don't want to. I haven't gone camping since. Haven't even hiked alone. I stay in hotels now, where there are locks, people, noise, and I never, ever stay in cabins. Because I know I had been wanting to take a break from everything for a long time. My job kept me in front of a screen for nearly 10 hours a day, and my phone never stopped buzzing. The noise, the people, the rush, it all just started to drain me. I knew I had to get out for a while. I needed space. I needed quiet. So, I decided to rent a small cabin in a remote area of northern Montana, not far from the Canadian border. I found it through a website that specialized in off-grid retreats. The listing said there was no cell service, no internet, no TV, just nature and silence. That's exactly what I needed. The pictures showed a small wooden cabin with a tin roof, set deep in a forest of tall pines and birch trees. There was a stream running nearby and a wood stove inside for heat. It looked peaceful, isolated. Just one gravel road leading in and out. The nearest town was about an hour away. I booked it for 7 days, starting on a Saturday. I packed my truck with canned food, water, a camp stove, a big cooler filled with ice, and plenty of firewood. I also brought a few books, a map, a knife, and a first aid kit. I wasn't new to the woods. I had done a good amount of solo hiking in my 20s, though it had been a few years since then. The drive up was long but beautiful. As I moved deeper into the mountains, the road narrowed and the trees grew thicker. I lost cell service about 2 hours before reaching the cabin. I followed the instructions printed on the confirmation email. They were very specific: turn left at the broken fence post, go straight for 3.2 miles, then turn right after the second creek crossing. That kind of thing. Eventually, I pulled up to the place just before sunset. The cabin looked just like the pictures, maybe even better. It sat on a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. A narrow path led down toward the stream. There was a fire pit out back and a small porch in front. The door was unlocked, just like the email said it would be. Inside, everything was simple and neat. A small table, a chair, a single bed with clean sheets, and a shelf with some matches, candles, and basic tools. No electricity, just a few lanterns. The wood stove was cold, but I got a fire going quickly. I had brought my own sleeping bag just in case, but the bed looked fine. That first night, I slept like a rock. No city noise, no light pollution, just the sounds of wind and trees. I woke up feeling more rested than I had in months. The next couple of days passed quietly. I spent most of my time reading, walking around the woods, sitting near the stream. I made simple meals, took notes in a little journal I had brought, and just enjoyed the quiet. But by the third night, things started to feel off. It was nothing big at first, just little things. I was sitting outside on the porch after dinner, watching the last bit of light fade behind the trees. The forest had gone quiet. Not just quiet, completely still. No birds, no insects, no rustling. It was like someone had turned the volume off. I brushed it off at first. Maybe it was just that time of evening when animals go quiet. But it kept happening around the same time each night. By the fourth day, I started noticing other things. Small things. I had stacked my firewood neatly beside the porch, but that morning, a few logs were scattered on the ground like someone had kicked them. I figured maybe an animal had knocked them over, though there were no claw marks or bite marks. I also found a small pile of pebbles placed near the front steps. They weren't there the day before. They looked arranged, like someone had set them there on purpose. I kicked them aside and tried not to think much of it. That afternoon, I went for a longer hike down past the stream and into the thicker woods. I brought my compass and the map just in case. After about an hour, I found an old trail that wasn't marked on the map. It was narrow and overgrown, but it looked like it had once been used. Maybe an old hunting trail. I decided to follow it for a bit. The deeper I went, the more I got the feeling that I shouldn't be there. The trees grew tighter, almost leaning over the path. The ground was soft with moss, and I didn't hear a single bird the whole time. After 20 minutes, I turned back. The forest didn't feel right. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up, not from sounds, but from silence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears. Around 3 a.m., I heard a noise. Just one, a sharp crack like a branch snapping. Then nothing. I sat up and listened, my heart pounding. The fire had burned low, and the cabin was dark. I stayed awake until dawn, too on edge to sleep. On day 5, I woke up tired and irritable. I didn't feel like hiking or reading. I mostly sat inside, watching the trees through the window. Around noon, I stepped out to use the bathroom, which was just a pit toilet about 20 yards from the cabin, and found something strange on the porch. Another pile of pebbles, slightly bigger this time, again neatly arranged, not spilled, not scattered, placed. I looked around the clearing. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I picked up a few rocks and threw them far into the woods. Then I went back inside and locked the door, even though it felt stupid. I told myself maybe a raccoon or some other animal was doing it, maybe even a person who lived nearby, just messing with me. I didn't want to believe that, but it was easier than thinking the alternative, that someone was coming close to the cabin at night while I slept. That night, I barely slept. I kept the axe beside the bed and stayed fully dressed. I heard small sounds outside, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but nothing clear. At one point, around 2 a.m., I swore I saw a shape pass in front of the window. Just a shadow, quick, like someone walking past. I didn't go to the window. I just stayed frozen in bed, breathing slow and quiet, my eyes locked on the door. On day 6, I was done pretending this was a normal trip. I was supposed to stay one more night, leave Saturday morning, but I made up my mind to leave that evening before it got dark. I didn't care about wasting the money. I packed up everything, shoved it into the truck, and cleaned up the cabin quickly. I didn't even eat. I just wanted to get out. Around 4:30 p.m., I started the truck and pulled out onto the dirt road. That road felt longer than I remembered. The trees felt tighter, darker. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone walking behind me. After about 20 minutes, I came to a spot where the road forked. The map and directions hadn't mentioned this. I stopped the truck and looked both ways. One path looked slightly wider with fresher tire tracks. The other was narrow, full of branches. I chose the wider path. I drove slowly, gripping the wheel hard. After 10 minutes, the road narrowed again and curved sharply downhill. My stomach sank. I didn't recognize anything. I stopped and checked the map again. Nothing matched. I backed up, turned around, and tried the other fork. Same thing, winding roads that went nowhere led to thick forest or circled back. It started getting dark. I realized I was lost. I drove for another hour, trying different turns, until I found myself back at the cabin. Somehow I had looped around. I didn't understand how. I had followed the road carefully. I should have been halfway to the main highway by then. My hands were shaking. I didn't want to go back inside, but night was falling fast. I didn't have a choice. That last night was the worst. I didn't unpack anything. I just kept the axe by the bed, one lantern on, and sat awake, staring at the door. Around midnight, I heard it. Not a twig, not a rustle. A knock, soft, deliberate. 3 slow knocks on the door. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I sat there for what felt like an hour. Eventually, I fell asleep sitting up, still holding the axe. When I woke up, it was morning. Sunlight was coming in through the window. I rushed outside. Nothing was there. No footprints, no rocks, nothing. I threw everything back into the truck, started the engine, and picked a direction. I didn't care if it was right or not. I just kept driving. By pure luck, I found the broken fence post from the original directions after nearly 2 hours of driving. From there, I followed the old route back to the highway. When I finally saw the first gas station, I almost broke down. I went inside, used the bathroom, bought coffee, and just sat in the parking lot for 30 minutes. I never reported anything. What would I say? That someone left rocks on my porch? That I got lost on a road that didn't exist on any map? It's been months since that trip. I haven't gone back into the woods since. I still think about it, especially at night. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But someone or something was watching me that whole time. And the worst part is, I think they wanted me to stay. Not as a guest, but as part of the forest.